Deep beneath the sun-scorched plains of central Turkey, carved into ancient volcanic rock by hands lost to history, lies a city that should not exist. 18 stories deep, miles of tunnels, rooms for 20,000 souls, ventilation shafts that breathe life into the darkness, wells that reach through the bones of the earth, and massive stone doors, each weighing half a ton, that could be rolled shut from the inside, sealing an entire civilization away from whatever terror waited above. This is Derinkuyu, the deepest underground city ever discovered, and after thousands of years buried in silence, it still guards its secrets. Who built it? What were they running from? And why, after centuries of use, was it suddenly abandoned and forgotten, erased from memory as though it never existed at all? Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. The story of Derinkuyu's modern rediscovery begins not with archaeologists or historians, not with scholars poring over ancient manuscripts or treasure hunters following cryptic maps. It begins with a man, a wall, and a chicken. In 1963, in the small, quiet town of Derinkuyu in the Nevşehir province of central Turkey, a local resident was renovating his home. He was knocking down a wall in his basement, a wall made of the same soft volcanic stone that composed most of the buildings and foundations in the region. When the wall came down, he found something behind it that made no sense. There was a room he had never seen before, a room that was not on any plan, a room that had no business being there. And from that room, a passageway led into darkness. He followed it, and the passageway led to another room, and that room led to another passageway. And that passageway descended, going deeper, curving, branching, splitting into corridors that ran in every direction. The man had stumbled onto something that would rewrite the understanding of ancient human engineering. He had found the entrance to an underground city that plunged more than 280 feet into the earth, a city with 18 confirmed levels, a city that could shelter an estimated 20,000 people along with their livestock and food supplies. A city carved entirely by hand from the soft but durable tough stone left behind by volcanic eruptions millions of years before. Now, some versions of this story mention that the man discovered the hidden passage because his chickens kept disappearing. He noticed that a few of his birds would wander behind the wall and simply vanish. When he investigated, when he broke through the wall to find where they were going, he discovered the tunnel entrance. Whether the chickens were the true catalyst or whether the renovation itself revealed the passage, the result was the same. An underground world lost for generations was suddenly open again. Word spread quickly through the town. Local authorities were contacted, archaeologists arrived, and as the exploration began, as researchers descended level by level into the cool, silent darkness beneath the Anatolian plateau, the scale of what had been found became staggering. This was not a cave, this was not a mine. This was not a simple shelter or a hiding place. This was a fully designed, fully functional, fully engineered underground city, complete with living quarters, kitchens, storage rooms, wineries, oil presses, chapels, schools, stables, arsenals, and an ingenious ventilation system that drew fresh air from the surface through shafts that penetrated all 18 levels. This was a place where thousands of people could live for months at a time, completely cut off from the world above, completely self-sufficient, completely invisible to anyone standing on the surface looking down. The discovery of Derinkuyu was not in isolation entirely surprising. The region of Cappadocia, where Derinkuyu is located, had long been known for its unusual landscape and its history of subterranean habitation. The famous fairy chimneys, tall, cone-shaped rock formations created by millennia of erosion, had drawn visitors and scholars for centuries. Cave dwellings, rock-cut churches, and underground storage rooms were common throughout the area, but Derinkuyu was different. Derinkuyu was not a collection of caves connected by accident or convenience. It was a planned city, an architectural achievement of extraordinary complexity, built with a sophistication that challenged assumptions about the capabilities of the ancient peoples who created it. To understand how such a city could exist and why it was built where it was built, you first have to understand the land itself. Cappadocia sits in the heart of the Anatolian Peninsula, a vast highland plateau that forms the geographic center of modern Turkey. It is a landscape shaped by fire and time. Millions of years ago, the volcanoes of the region, Mount Erciyes, Mount Hassan, and others, erupted repeatedly, blanketing the surrounding plains in thick layers of ash and lava. Over time, this volcanic material compressed and solidified into a type of rock called tuff, also known as tufa. Tuff is a remarkable material. When it is first exposed, when it is freshly cut or newly revealed, it is relatively soft. You can carve it with simple tools, with bronze chisels, with iron picks, even with hardened wooden implements if you're patient enough. But once tuff is exposed to air for an extended period, it undergoes a chemical process. It hardens, it becomes durable, resistant, strong. This unique property made tuff the perfect building material for underground construction. You could carve it easily when you first cut into it, shaping rooms and corridors and stairways with relatively modest effort. But once your carving was done, once the rooms were shaped and the tunnels were formed, the rock would harden around you, creating structures that were naturally reinforced, naturally insulated, and naturally resistant to collapse. The people who lived in Cappadocia discovered this property early. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans have been carving into the soft rock of the region for thousands of years, creating homes, storage facilities, and places of worship. The landscape itself seemed to invite habitation. The fairy chimneys, those towering stone pillars with their mushroom-shaped caps, were natural shelters that could be hollowed out and expanded. The cliff faces along the valleys provided ready-made walls that could be carved into multi-room dwellings. And the flat plains above, covered in that same volcanic tuff, could be excavated downward, creating underground spaces that were cool in the brutal Anatolian summer, warm in the freezing Anatolian winter, and hidden from anyone who might come across the surface with hostile intentions. But what happened at Derinkuyu went far beyond simple cave dwelling. What happened at Derinkuyu was something closer to urban planning on a scale that boggles the modern mind. Let us descend together into the city. Let us go level by level, passage by passage, and try to comprehend what was created here. The entrance to Derinkuyu is deceptively modest. From the surface, you would never guess what lies below. There is no grand gateway, no monumental facade, no carved inscription announcing the presence of a city beneath your feet. There are, in fact, multiple entrances scattered across the town, many of them hidden in the basements of houses, in the floors of courtyards, behind walls that look no different from any other wall. This was deliberate. The whole point of Derinkuyu was concealment. If you were building a city to hide in, you would not advertise its location with an elaborate entrance. You would make the way in as invisible as possible. The first level is relatively shallow, lying just below the surface. Here in the uppermost chambers, archaeologists found evidence of stables, long, low-ceilinged rooms with troughs carved into the stone walls, spaces designed to hold livestock. Cattle, sheep, goats, donkeys, the animals that sustained life in ancient Anatolia would have been brought down into the city when the population retreated underground. The stables were positioned on the first level for practical reasons. Animals produce waste, they produce heat, they produce odors. Keeping them near the surface, close to the ventilation shafts and the exits, minimized the impact on the air quality deeper below. It also meant that the animals could be brought in and out relatively quickly if the emergency was brief or if supplies needed to be moved. Adjacent to the stables on this same first level were storage rooms. Archaeologists identified these by the stone rings carved into the walls, rings that would have held ropes for securing bags of grain, dried fruit, preserved meat, and other foodstuffs. There were also large stone vessels, some of them carved directly into the floor, that would have held oil, wine, or water. The storage capacity on the first level alone was significant, enough to sustain hundreds of people for weeks, but this was only the beginning. As you descend to the second level, the nature of the spaces changes. Here, the rooms become larger, the ceilings higher, the layout more complex. This is where the living quarters begin. Families would have occupied rooms on the second and third levels, rooms that were small by modern standards but functional. with sleeping platforms carved from the rock, niches in the walls for oil lamps, and ventilation channels that connected to the main shafts running vertically through the city. The rooms are arranged in clusters, suggesting that extended families or community groups would have lived together, sharing common spaces for cooking and socializing while maintaining private sleeping quarters. The corridors connecting these rooms are narrow, deliberately so. A single person can walk through them without difficulty, but two people cannot walk side by side. This was a defensive feature. If an invader somehow found an entrance and penetrated into the city, the narrow corridors would force them to advance single file, making them vulnerable to defenders who could hold a corridor against a much larger force with minimal effort. The corridors also twist and turn, sometimes doubling back on themselves, sometimes leading to dead ends. Navigation through Derinkuyu without knowledge of the layout would have been virtually impossible. You could wander for hours in the dark, disoriented, lost, while the inhabitants waited in safety deeper below. On the third and fourth levels, the city reveals more of its infrastructure. Here, archaeologists discovered kitchens, rooms with blackened ceilings from centuries of cooking fires, with ventilation channels specifically designed to draw smoke upward and out through the surface shafts. The smoke management system was crucial. In an underground city, uncontrolled smoke would be lethal. The builders of Derinkuyu understood this and engineered their kitchens with flues and channels that directed smoke away from living areas and up through dedicated shafts. Some researchers have noted that the smoke shafts were designed to disperse the smoke over a wide area on the surface, preventing the telltale column of smoke that would reveal the city's location to anyone watching from above. Also on these middle levels, archaeologists found what they believed to be communal dining areas, larger rooms with stone benches carved along the walls, rooms that could accommodate dozens of people eating together. The social structure of life in Derinkuyu was clearly organized around community. This was not a place of isolated individuals hiding alone in the dark. This was a society, a functioning community with shared meals, shared responsibilities, and shared spaces. But the most remarkable features of Derinkuyu are not the living quarters or the kitchens or even the stables. The most remarkable features are the systems, the engineering solutions that made underground life possible for thousands of people over extended periods. First among these is the ventilation system. Derinkuyu has approximately 52 ventilation shafts, though the exact number is still debated as new passages continue to be discovered. These shafts run vertically through the rock, connecting the deepest levels of the city to the surface above. The longest of these shafts extends roughly 180 feet from top to bottom, a vertical bore drilled through solid rock with nothing but hand tools and human determination. The shafts serve a dual purpose. They bring fresh air down into the city, creating a natural circulation system that draws stale air upward and pulls clean air downward. And many of the shafts also serve as wells, providing access to the underground water table that lies beneath the Anatolian plateau. The water system is particularly ingenious. The builders of Derinkuyu tapped into the natural groundwater, carving wells that reached down to the water table and distributed water to various levels of the city through a network of channels and reservoirs. But here is the truly clever part. The wells on the lowest levels could be sealed off independently. If an invading force somehow gained access to the upper levels, the defenders below could block the wells above them, denying the invaders access to water while maintaining their own supply from the deeper sources. This suggests a level of strategic thinking that goes beyond simple shelter construction. The builders of Derinkuyu were thinking about siege warfare. They were thinking about what would happen if the city was partially compromised. They were thinking about defense in depth, about fallback positions, about denying resources to an enemy, concepts that military strategists would formalize thousands of years later. The water system also had a secondary security function. Because the wells penetrated from the surface all the way down through multiple levels, they represented a potential vulnerability. An enemy who discovered a well shaft on the surface might try to poison the water supply, contaminating it to force the inhabitants out. The segmented design of the water system, with its independent wells on different levels, mitigated this risk. Even if the upper wells were poisoned, the deeper wells remained safe. And then there are the doors. The great stone doors of Derinkuyu are perhaps its most iconic feature, and they represent one of the most effective passive defense systems ever devised in the ancient world. Scattered throughout the city, at key junctures between levels and at critical choke points in the tunnel system, massive circular stones were positioned to serve as doors. These stones are typically about 5 feet in diameter and about a foot thick, weighing approximately 1,000 pounds, half a ton of solid volcanic rock. They are shaped like enormous wheels, slightly tapered, and they sit in carved channels that allow them to be rolled across corridor openings. When rolled into place, they seal the passageway completely. No amount of pushing from the other side can move them, because the channels are designed so that the stone can only be operated from the inside. There's a small hole in the center of each stone door, but this is not a handle. It is designed to allow defenders to thrust spears or pour liquids through the door at anyone attempting to breach it from the other side. The placement of these doors is strategic. They are not positioned randomly. They are placed at the transitions between levels, so that if one level was compromised, the levels below could be sealed off. They are placed at the entrances from the surface, so that the entire city could be locked down in moments. They are placed at intersections, so that specific sections of the city could be isolated without affecting others. The entire defensive architecture of Derinkuyu is based on compartmentalization, the ability to seal off sections, deny access, create barriers, and force any attacker into a series of increasingly difficult choke points where a handful of defenders could hold off a much larger force. This was not the work of frightened villagers digging holes to hide in. This was military engineering of the highest order. As we continue our descent, passing the 5th, 6th, 7th levels, the city opens up in unexpected ways. On the 5th level, archaeologists discovered what appears to be a cruciform church, a room carved in the shape of a cross, with a vaulted ceiling and carved columns. This church dates to the early Byzantine period, suggesting that Christians used the underground city as a place of worship and during times of persecution as a place of refuge. The church is surprisingly large, capable of holding a congregation of several hundred. Its presence on the 5th level, deep underground, tells us something important about the people who used this space. They were not just surviving down here. They were living, they were worshiping. They were maintaining their culture, their identity, their faith, even in the depths of the earth. Near the church, on the same level, archaeologists found what they believed to be a school or a meeting hall, a large, open room with stone benches arranged in rows, facing a raised platform at one end. If this was indeed a school, it tells us that the inhabitants of Derinkuyu expected to be underground for extended periods, long enough that children would need to continue their education, long enough that learning and knowledge transmission would need to carry on despite the extraordinary circumstances. The 7th and 8th levels contain more storage rooms, more living quarters, and several spaces that archaeologists have identified as wineries and oil presses. The production of wine and olive oil was central to life in ancient Anatolia, and the fact that these production facilities exist deep underground suggests that the inhabitants were not just storing supplies, they were manufacturing them. They were pressing grapes, fermenting wine, crushing olives, producing oil, all in the cool, temperature-stable environment of the underground city. The natural temperature deep in the tunnels hovers around a consistent 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, making it an ideal environment for fermentation and food preservation. Below the 8th level, the city becomes more mysterious. The lower levels 9 through 18 are less well explored and less well understood. Some of these levels are partially flooded, making excavation difficult. Others have collapsed in places, blocking access to chambers and corridors that remain unseen and unstudied. What we know about these deepest levels comes from limited exploration and from the ventilation shafts that continue to descend through them. The deepest confirmed level, the 18th, lies approximately 280 feet below the surface. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the height of a 25 to 30-story building, inverted, carved downward into the earth. Standing at the bottom of Derinkuyu, you are deeper underground than most subway systems, deeper than most modern basements, deeper than most mines that existed in the ancient world. And you are standing in a space that was carved by hand, without power tools, without machinery, without modern engineering knowledge, carved by people using bronze and iron tools, oil lamps, and sheer, relentless human labor. How long did it take to build? This is one of the great unanswered questions about Derinkuyu. Estimates vary wildly. Some scholars believe the city was built over centuries, with each generation adding new levels, expanding existing rooms, and extending the tunnel network. Others believe that the core of the city, the main shafts, the primary levels, the essential infrastructure, was built in a concentrated period of construction, perhaps a few decades, with later modifications and expansions happening over time. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The scale of excavation required is enormous. Researchers have estimated that the total amount of rock removed from Derinkuyu amounts to millions of cubic feet of material. Where did all that rock go? The surface of the town offers no obvious evidence of massive rock dumps or quarry piles. The excavated material may have been used for surface construction, spread across agricultural fields, or carried away and deposited at a distance from the city to avoid revealing its location. The labor required is equally staggering. Even with the relatively soft nature of fresh tuff, carving a city of this size would have required thousands of workers over an extended period. The logistics of the construction, removing the cut rock, maintaining air supply during excavation, ensuring structural stability as you dug deeper, managing water seepage, planning the layout so that ventilation shafts aligned properly across 18 levels. All of this required sophisticated planning, engineering knowledge, and organizational capacity. So who built it? This is where the story of Derinkuyu moves from engineering marvel to historical mystery, because the honest answer is that we do not know for certain. Multiple theories exist, each with supporting evidence, each with unanswered questions. The oldest theory, and the one that still commands significant scholarly support, attributes the initial construction of Derinkuyu to the Phrygians. The Phrygians were an ancient Indo-European people who migrated into Anatolia around the 12th century before the Common Era, during the upheaval that accompanied the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations. They established a powerful kingdom in central Anatolia, with their capital at Gordium, the city made famous by the legend of the Gordian knot. The Phrygians were known as skilled builders and metalworkers, and they had extensive experience with rock-cut architecture. Many Phrygian monuments, tombs, and temples were carved directly into cliff faces and rock formations, demonstrating a cultural affinity for working with stone and an understanding of how to shape living rock into functional spaces. Archaeological evidence supports the Phrygian connection. Pottery fragments found in the upper levels of Derinkuyu have been tentatively dated to the Phrygian period, and the construction techniques used in the oldest sections of the city are consistent with known Phrygian building methods. The Phrygians also had a compelling motive for underground construction. Their kingdom was repeatedly threatened by invaders, first by the Cimmerians, nomadic warriors from the steppes north of the Black Sea who swept through Anatolia in the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, and later by the Lydians and the Persians. The Phrygian heartland in the open plains of central Anatolia offered little natural defense against mounted raiders. Going underground was a logical survival strategy, but the Phrygian theory may not tell the whole story. Some scholars believe that the earliest levels of Derinkuyu predate the Phrygians by centuries, perhaps even millennia. The ancient Greek historian Xenophon, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, described underground dwellings in Anatolia that he attributed to the local population. In his work Anabasis, the account of the Greek mercenary army's retreat through Anatolia after the failed expedition of Cyrus the Younger, Xenophon described villages where the houses were underground, with entrances like wells, broad at the bottom and narrow at the top. He noted that these underground dwellings housed families along with their livestock, that the inhabitants brewed barley wine, and that they stored grain and other provisions in subterranean rooms. While Xenophon was not specifically describing Derinkuyu, his account confirms that underground habitation was well established in Anatolia by the 4th century before the Common Era and was likely much older. Some researchers have pushed the origins even further back, suggesting that the earliest excavations at Derinkuyu may date to the Hittite period, the great empire that dominated Anatolia from roughly the 17th to the 12th century before the Common Era. The Hittites were one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world, controlling a territory that stretched from the Aegean coast to the upper reaches of the Euphrates. They were master builders, constructing massive fortifications, temples, and palaces. They were also skilled in underground construction, as evidenced by the tunnels and storage chambers found beneath several Hittite cities. The collapse of the Hittite Empire around 1200 before the Common Era, part of the broader Bronze Age collapse that destroyed multiple civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean, would have left the surviving populations of central Anatolia vulnerable and desperate for defensible shelter. The initial excavation of underground refuges, which would later grow into full-scale cities like Derinkuyu, may have begun during this period of chaos and vulnerability. There's even a theory, less widely accepted but fascinating nonetheless, that attributes the earliest levels of Derinkuyu to an even older people, the Proto-Hittite or Hatti civilization that occupied central Anatolia before the arrival of the Indo-European Hittites. The Hatti were a pre-Indo-European people about whom relatively little is known, but they were established in Anatolia by at least the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, and they had a well-developed culture with sophisticated building traditions. Could the Hatti have begun the underground excavations that later peoples expanded and refined? It is possible, but at this point the evidence is speculative. What is clear is that Derinkuyu was not built by a single people in a single period. It was a multi-generational project, a living structure that grew and evolved over centuries, perhaps millennia. Each successive civilization that occupied the Cappadocian region, the Hatti, the Hittites, the Phrygians, the Persians, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Seljuk Turks, the Ottomans, left its mark on the underground city, adding new levels, expanding existing ones, modifying the layout to meet changing needs, and adapting the space to reflect new technologies, new threats, and new ways of life. But the question of who built Derinkuyu is inseparable from the question of why. What drove people to undertake such a monumental construction project? What threat was so persistent, so terrifying, that an entire population would choose to live underground rather than face it on the surface? The most straightforward answer is invasion. Central Anatolia, for all its agricultural richness and strategic importance, has always been a crossroads, a place where empires collide, where armies march, where the tides of conquest wash back and forth across the landscape. The peoples of Cappadocia lived in the path of nearly every major military movement in the ancient and medieval world. They faced the Cimmerians, the Persians, the Macedonians, the Romans, the Sassanids, the Arabs, the Mongols, the Seljuks, the Crusaders, the Ottomans, an almost unbroken succession of invading forces stretching across 3,000 years of history. For the common people of the region, the farmers, the herders, the craftsmen, the families' survival depended on the ability to disappear. When the dust cloud of an approaching army appeared on the horizon, when the lookouts on the hilltops signaled that riders were coming, the people of Cappadocia did not form battle lines. They did not man the walls of fortresses. They went underground. They gathered their families, their livestock, their food supplies, and they descended into the earth, sealing the entrances behind them with those massive stone doors and waiting in the cool darkness until the danger passed. This strategy was remarkably effective. An invading army might sweep through a village, find it empty, search the houses, take whatever portable goods remained on the surface, and move on, never suspecting that thousands of people were living directly beneath their feet. The underground cities were invisible from the surface. Their entrances were hidden. Their ventilation shafts, while allowing air to flow, were small enough to be overlooked or mistaken for natural features of the landscape. An army in a hurry, and ancient armies were almost always in a hurry, driven by the need to maintain supply lines and momentum, would not waste time searching for hidden underground passages in what appeared to be a deserted village. Even if an invading force did discover an entrance, taking the underground city by force would have been virtually impossible. The narrow corridors, the massive stone doors, the labyrinthine layout, the ability of defenders to seal off individual levels, all of these features made Derinkuyu a fortress of extraordinary resilience. An army of thousands could be held at bay by a few dozen defenders in the narrow corridors. The attackers could not use their numerical advantage. They could not deploy cavalry or siege engines underground. They could not see in the darkness. They could not breathe if the defenders blocked the ventilation shafts above them. The only option would have been a prolonged siege, blocking the entrances and waiting for the inhabitants to exhaust their supplies. But the inhabitants had enough stored food and water to last for months, and they had multiple exits, some of them emerging miles from the main entrances, allowing scouts and foragers to slip out under cover of darkness. The Arab invasions of the 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era represent one of the most well-documented periods when the underground cities of Cappadocia were actively used for refuge. After the rise of Islam in the 7th century, Arab armies launched repeated incursions into the Byzantine Empire, pushing northward through Syria and into the Anatolian heartland. These campaigns were often devastating for the local population. The Arab raiders, while sometimes seeking permanent conquest, were frequently conducting punitive raids, fast-moving expeditions designed to plunder resources, destroy military infrastructure, and demonstrate the power of the caliphate. For the Christian communities of Cappadocia, these raids were existential threats. The Arab armies could appear with little warning, strike hard, and withdraw before the Byzantine military could mount an effective response. The underground cities became critical to survival during this period. Historical sources from the Byzantine era reference the use of underground refuges in Cappadocia, and archaeological evidence from Derinkuyu and the nearby underground city of Kaymakli confirms extensive habitation during the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. The cruciform church on the 5th level of Derinkuyu, with its carved crosses and its vaulted ceiling, almost certainly dates to this period. The Christian communities of Cappadocia were maintaining their religious practices underground, worshipping in hand-carved churches lit by oil lamps, baptizing their children in stone fonts, and celebrating their liturgy in the heart of the earth while Arab cavalry patrolled the surface above. But the Arab raids, while significant, were only one chapter in the long history of threats that drove the people of Cappadocia underground. Before the Arabs came the Sassanid Persians, who launched devastating invasions of eastern Anatolia in the early 7th century. Before the Sassanids came the various nomadic peoples of the Central Asian steppes, the Huns, the Avars, the Bulgars, who periodically swept through Anatolia on campaigns of plunder and destruction. Before the nomads came the Roman legions, and before the Romans came the Macedonians, and before the Macedonians came the Persians under Cyrus the Great, and before Cyrus came the Cimmerians. The history of Central Anatolia is a history of invasion, and Derinkuyu is in many ways a physical record of that history, a monument to the determination of ordinary people to survive in the face of overwhelming military force. Yet invasion alone does not fully explain Derinkuyu. Other regions of the ancient world faced persistent threats of invasion, the peoples of the Levant, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and while they built fortifications and refuges, none of them created anything comparable to the underground cities of Cappadocia. Something about the specific combination of factors in this region made underground construction not just possible but preferable, and that something was the geological foundation we discussed earlier, the volcanic tuff. Without the tuff, Derinkuyu could not exist. The same city, built in granite or limestone or sandstone, would have been orders of magnitude more difficult to construct. Granite is too hard, limestone is prone to collapse, sandstone is too porous, allowing water infiltration that would make deep underground habitation impossible. Tuff, with its unique combination of initial softness and eventual hardness, with its resistance to water penetration, with its natural insulating properties, was the perfect medium. The geology of Cappadocia did not merely enable Derinkuyu, it inspired it. The people of the region looked at the rock beneath their feet and saw a possibility. They saw a substance that could be shaped, that could be hollowed, that could be transformed from raw earth into habitable space with nothing but human labor and simple tools. The volcanic origin of the tuff also provided another crucial advantage: stability. The tuff deposits in Cappadocia are thick, uniform, and largely free of the faults and fractures that plague other types of rock. When you carve a room in Cappadocian tuff, the ceiling does not collapse, the walls do not crack, the floor does not shift. The stone holds its shape with remarkable fidelity, century after century, millennium after millennium. Rooms carved 2,000 years ago look essentially the same today as they did when they were first created. This stability made deep excavation possible. The builders of Derinkuyu could dig down level after level, confident that the rock above them would hold, that the ceilings would not cave in, that the tunnels would not collapse under the weight of the earth. This geological gift was not unlimited, however. The builders still had to exercise care and skill in their excavation. They had to ensure that the pillars of rock left between rooms were thick enough to support the weight above. They had to account for the water table, designing drainage systems that prevented flooding on the lower levels. They had to plan their ventilation shafts with precision, ensuring that each shaft was wide enough to provide adequate airflow but narrow enough to prevent entry by hostile forces. The fact that they did all of this successfully, across 18 levels and thousands of rooms, speaks to an extraordinary level of engineering knowledge and practical skill. Let us now consider the daily life of the people who lived in Derinkuyu. Not the builders, not the engineers, not the planners, but the ordinary families, the men, women, and children who descended into the darkness when danger came and lived underground for days, weeks, or even months at a time. Imagine it. Imagine the moment when the warning comes, a horn blast from the watchtower, a shout from a rider galloping in from the east, dust on the horizon. An army is coming. You have done this before. Your parents did it before you, and their parents before them. You know the drill. You gather your family. You collect the essentials: grain, dried meat, water, skins, blankets, oil for lamps, tools, weapons. You call the livestock, the goats, the sheep, the few precious cattle. You move quickly but without panic. Everyone in the village knows their assigned entrance. Everyone knows which level, which corridor, which room is theirs. The system has been refined over generations. You descend. The air grows cooler as you go down. The sounds of the surface, the wind, the birds, the distant thunder of hooves fade and disappear, replaced by the echo of footsteps, the bleating of goats, the murmur of voices in the tunnels. Oil lamps flicker in niches carved into the walls, casting dancing shadows on the stone. The corridors are narrow and you walk single file, one hand trailing along the cool rock wall for guidance. Children cling to their parents. The elderly move slowly, supported by younger family members. Everyone carries something: a sack of grain, a bundle of firewood, a clay jug of water. You reach your room. It is small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with a ceiling just high enough to stand in. The sleeping platforms are carved into the walls, covered with straw and blankets. There is a niche for a lamp, a shelf carved into the stone for your belongings, a ventilation channel in the ceiling that brings a faint current of fresh air. You set down your supplies, you light your lamp. The room fills with warm, amber light. You are safe, but you are also underground. You are surrounded by stone on all sides. The air is still, cool, slightly damp. There is no sunlight. There are no stars, no horizon, no open sky. The world has shrunk to this room, this corridor, this level of the city. Time becomes elastic, unmeasured by the passage of the sun. You eat when you are hungry. You sleep when you are tired, you pray when the call comes for prayer. The community organizes itself quickly. Cooking is done in the designated kitchens, where fires are carefully managed to minimize smoke. Water is drawn from the wells, rationed, distributed. Livestock are tended in the stables on the upper level. Children are gathered for lessons, told stories, given small tasks to keep them occupied. The adults take turns standing watch at the sealed entrances, listening for sounds from above, peering through the small holes in the stone doors for any sign of the enemy. Days pass, perhaps a week, perhaps longer. The routines of underground life become familiar, even comfortable. The temperature is constant, neither hot nor cold. The darkness, once oppressive, becomes simply normal. The sounds of the city, the murmur of conversation, the crying of babies, the distant bleating of goats, the rhythmic grinding of grain on stone create a kind of subterranean symphony, a soundtrack of survival. And then one day, the watchers at the entrances report silence above. The army has moved on. The scouts slip out through the hidden exits, climbing up through narrow shafts to emerge blinking in the sunlight, scanning the horizon for any sign of lingering danger. They find the village damaged, roofs burned, storerooms looted, fields trampled, but the essential structures are intact. The invaders took what they could carry and moved on, never knowing that thousands of people were living beneath the ground they walked on. The all clear is given. The stone doors are rolled back. The people of Derinkuyu emerge, climbing up through the levels, emerging into the light, returning to their surface homes to begin the process of repair and recovery. Until the next time. This cycle, retreat, endurance, emergence, recovery, repeated itself countless times over the centuries. And each repetition taught the people of Derinkuyu something new, prompted some improvement, some refinement, some expansion of the underground city. The ventilation system was improved, new wells were dug. Additional storage rooms were carved. The tunnel network was extended, linking Derinkuyu to other underground cities in the region through passages that ran for miles beneath the surface. This last point deserves special attention. Derinkuyu is not an isolated underground city. It is part of a network. Across the Cappadocian landscape, more than 200 underground cities have been discovered, ranging from small shelters with only a few rooms to massive complexes rivaling Derinkuyu itself. The largest of these is Kaymakli, located approximately 5 miles to the north, which has 8 confirmed levels and is believed to extend even deeper. And connecting Derinkuyu to Kaymakli, running beneath the Anatolian plateau for approximately 5 miles, is a tunnel. 5 miles, underground, carved through solid rock. The existence of this tunnel, confirmed by archaeologists but only partially explored due to collapses and flooding, suggests that the underground cities of Cappadocia were not independent refuges but components of a larger system, a network of interconnected subterranean communities that could communicate, share resources, and coordinate their defense across a wide geographic area. If one city was threatened, its inhabitants could potentially evacuate through the connecting tunnels to another city miles away, emerging from an entrance that the attackers would never think to look for. The implications of this are extraordinary. We are not talking about a single underground shelter. We are talking about an underground civilization, a parallel world beneath the surface, connected by miles of tunnels, populated by thousands of people, equipped with everything needed to sustain life for extended periods. The scale of human effort represented by this network is almost impossible to comprehend. The total amount of rock excavated across all the underground cities of Cappadocia, including the connecting tunnels, has been estimated at tens of millions of cubic feet. The labor required would have occupied thousands of workers over hundreds of years. This was not a project undertaken by a single community in response to a single threat. This was a multi-generational, multi-community endeavor that spanned centuries and represented a fundamental adaptation to living in one of the most contested landscapes in human history. Now let us turn to one of the most intriguing and debated aspects of Derinkuyu, its religious significance. The underground city was not merely a shelter. It was also, at various points in its history, a sacred space, a place of worship, a sanctuary for persecuted religious communities seeking refuge from oppression. The most prominent evidence of religious use is the cruciform church on the fifth level that we mentioned earlier, but there are other indicators as well. Throughout the city, archaeologists have found carved crosses, religious inscriptions, and niches that appear to have served as altars or icon stands. These features date primarily to the Byzantine period, from roughly the 4th to the 11th centuries of the Common Era, when Christianity was the dominant religion of the region and the underground cities served as refuges for Christian communities during periods of persecution and invasion. The early centuries of Christianity were marked by periodic persecutions, first by the Roman authorities and later by various heretical factions and rival religious groups. Cappadocia played a significant role in the development of early Christian theology. Three of the most important early church fathers, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus, collectively known as the Cappadocian Fathers, were from this region, and their theological writings profoundly influenced the development of Christian doctrine. The tradition of using underground spaces for worship and refuge was well established in Cappadocia by the time of the Arab invasions in the 7th century, and the underground cities provided a ready-made infrastructure for communities seeking to maintain their religious practices in secret. But the religious significance of Derinkuyu may extend beyond Christianity. Some scholars have suggested that the deeper levels of the city, those dating to the pre-Christian era, may have served as religious spaces for earlier faiths, Phrygian religion, Zoroastrianism, or even older Anatolian belief systems. The evidence for this is limited and largely speculative, but the presence of certain architectural features on the deepest levels, rounded chambers, central columns, unusual carvings, has led some researchers to propose that these spaces may have had ritual or ceremonial functions. One particularly intriguing theory connects Derinkuyu to Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion centered on the worship of Ahura Mazda and the cosmic struggle between light and darkness. Zoroastrian tradition places great importance on fire, and some researchers have noted that certain chambers in Derinkuyu appear to have been designed for fire-related rituals, with carefully positioned ventilation channels that would have supported sustained flames in enclosed spaces. The Persians controlled Cappadocia for several centuries, from the 6th to the 4th centuries before the Common Era, and Zoroastrian influence in the region during this period is well documented. Could some of the deeper chambers of Derinkuyu have served as Zoroastrian fire temples? It is an intriguing possibility, though definitive evidence has not yet been found. There is another theory about Derinkuyu that we must address, one that has gained significant attention in popular culture even as it remains outside the mainstream of academic scholarship. This is the theory that the underground cities of Cappadocia were built not to shelter their inhabitants from human invaders, but to protect them from something else entirely, something from the sky. Proponents of this theory point to several features of Derinkuyu that they argue are difficult to explain by the invasion hypothesis alone. Why go so deep? If the goal was simply to hide from a passing army, why excavate 18 levels and descend nearly 300 feet into the earth? A few levels would have been sufficient. Why build such elaborate ventilation systems if you only expected to be underground for a few days or weeks? Why construct permanent infrastructure, churches, schools, wineries, in a shelter that was supposed to be temporary? These questions have led some researchers to suggest that the underground cities were designed for long-term habitation, not brief refuge, that their builders intended to live underground for months or even years at a time. What threat would require such extended subterranean existence? Some have proposed environmental catastrophe, volcanic eruptions, prolonged winters caused by volcanic ash blocking the sun, or other natural disasters that would make the surface uninhabitable. The volcanic history of the region lends some credibility to this idea. If the volcanoes of Cappadocia erupted during a period of habitation, or if distant volcanic events caused climatic disruption that affected the region, going underground would have been a logical survival strategy. Others have gone further, proposing that the underground cities were built to shelter their inhabitants from aerial threats, not modern aircraft, but ancient ones. This theory intersects with claims about ancient advanced civilizations, unidentified aerial phenomena, and other speculative ideas that occupy the fringe of historical scholarship. While these theories are fascinating to consider, they remain unsupported by the archaeological evidence currently available. The mainstream scholarly consensus remains that Derinkuyu and the other underground cities of Cappadocia were built primarily as defensive shelters against the persistent threat of invasion in one of the most contested regions of the ancient world. What is not in dispute is the extraordinary sophistication of the design, the monumental scale of the construction, and the remarkable effectiveness of the underground cities as survival infrastructure. Whatever the original motivation, the result was one of the most impressive engineering achievements of the ancient world. To truly appreciate the engineering of Derinkuyu, let us look more closely at some of the specific technical challenges that the builders faced and the solutions they developed. First, structural integrity. When you excavate underground, you are essentially creating voids in the earth. The rock above those voids still has to support its own weight plus the weight of everything above it, the surface soil, the buildings, the people walking around on top. If you remove too much rock from a single area, if you make your rooms too wide or your ceilings too thin, the whole thing collapses. The builders of Derinkuyu understood this intuitively, even if they did not have the formal engineering mathematics that modern structural engineers use. They left thick pillars of undisturbed rock between their rooms. They kept their ceilings vaulted, distributing the weight of the overlying rock across the curved surface, rather than concentrating it at a single point. They avoided creating large open spans where the unsupported ceiling might crack and fall. And they positioned their rooms and corridors so that the loads from one level were transferred down through the supporting pillars to the levels below, creating a cascading support structure that distributed the weight of the entire city across a broad foundation of undisturbed rock at the deepest levels. Second, air management. This is perhaps the most critical challenge in underground construction. Humans need oxygen. We exhale carbon dioxide. In an enclosed space, the oxygen level drops and the carbon dioxide level rises, eventually reaching a point where consciousness is lost and death follows. In a city housing 20,000 people plus livestock, the air supply problem is magnified enormously. The ventilation shafts of Derinkuyu solved this problem through a combination of natural convection and engineered airflow. The shafts were positioned to take advantage of temperature differentials. The air deep in the city was warmer than the surface air, causing it to rise naturally through the shafts and drawing cooler, oxygen-rich air downward through other openings. This natural convection cycle created a continuous flow of fresh air through the city without any mechanical assistance. The builders also carved smaller channels connecting individual rooms and corridors to the main shafts, ensuring that air circulated into every occupied space. The effectiveness of this ventilation system is confirmed by the fact that people actually lived in the deepest levels of the city for extended periods. If the ventilation had been inadequate, habitation below the first few levels would have been impossible. The fact that rooms on the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th levels show evidence of habitation tells us that the air supply reached all the way down, that the ventilation system worked as designed, and that the builders had achieved something remarkable: the creation of a breathable atmosphere nearly 300 feet below the surface using nothing but carved stone channels and the natural physics of air movement. Third, waste management. 20,000 people produce a significant amount of waste: human waste, animal waste, food waste, ash from cooking fires. Managing this waste in an enclosed underground space was essential for health and habitability. While the specific waste management systems of Derinkuyu are not fully understood, archaeologists have identified several features that appear to relate to sanitation. There are rooms that appear to have served as latrines, positioned near ventilation shafts to reduce odors. There are channels carved into the floors of certain corridors that may have served as drainage systems, carrying liquid waste downward to collection points on the lowest levels. And there is evidence that certain chambers on the deepest levels may have served as cesspits or waste repositories, positioned as far as possible from the living quarters and the water supply. The health implications of underground living are significant and should not be underestimated. Infectious disease, respiratory problems, and psychological stress are all serious risks in enclosed subterranean environments. The fact that the people of Derinkuyu managed these risks well enough to sustain a population of thousands for extended periods tells us that they had developed practical knowledge of hygiene, disease prevention, and environmental management that was remarkably advanced for its time. Fourth, lighting. The underground city is, of course, completely dark. There is no natural light below the first level. Every room, every corridor, every stairway, every workspace had to be illuminated by artificial means. The primary source of light in Derinkuyu was the oil lamp, small ceramic or stone vessels filled with olive oil or animal fat, with wicks made of twisted fiber. Thousands of these lamps would have been needed to light the city, and the amount of oil consumed would have been substantial. Niches carved into the walls of every room and corridor served as lamp holders, and the blackened ceilings throughout the city testify to centuries of smoke from these flames. The management of lamp fuel was a significant logistical challenge. Olive oil was a valuable commodity, and using it for illumination on this scale required a reliable supply. The oil presses found within the underground city suggest that the inhabitants were producing their own oil underground, pressing olives that had been brought down from the surface or stored in advance. The winery similarly suggests on-site production of wine, which could also serve as a source of fuel. Wine dregs and pumice, the solid remains left after pressing, could be burned for heat and light, but oil lamps have limitations. They produce a relatively dim light, they consume oxygen, and they generate smoke and heat. In the enclosed spaces of Derinkuyu, these effects would have been cumulative. A single lamp in a small room would be tolerable. Hundreds of lamps burning simultaneously in a warren of interconnected tunnels would significantly affect air quality. This makes the ventilation system even more impressive. It had to handle not just the respiratory needs of 20,000 people and their livestock, but also the combustion products of thousands of oil lamps. Fifth, and finally, there is the challenge of psychological endurance. Living underground is not natural for human beings. We are creatures of light, of open spaces, of horizons and sky. The confinement, the darkness, the constant awareness of the weight of earth above, these are psychologically demanding conditions that can lead to anxiety, claustrophobia, depression, and social conflict. The builders of Derinkuyu seem to have been aware of these psychological challenges and designed the city to mitigate them where possible. The larger communal spaces, the church, the meeting hall, the dining areas, provided social gathering points where people could come together, maintain social bonds, and sustain a sense of community. The wineries and oil presses provided productive activity that gave people purpose and occupation. The school ensured that children's lives maintained some normalcy even in the most abnormal circumstances. The religious spaces were perhaps the most important psychological support of all. In a world of darkness and confinement, the church on the fifth level offered something transcendent, a connection to the divine, a reminder that there was meaning beyond the stone walls, a source of hope that the surface world would be waiting when the danger passed. As the centuries progressed, the underground cities of Cappadocia continued to evolve. Each new period brought new users, new threats, and new modifications. The Romans, who incorporated Cappadocia into their empire in the 1st century of the Common Era, may have used the underground cities for storage and military purposes. Roman-era artifacts have been found in several of the underground sites, though the extent of Roman use is debated. The Byzantines, as we have discussed, made extensive use of the cities during the Arab raids of the 7th through 9th centuries, and the Christian communities of the region left a significant religious imprint on the spaces. The Seljuk Turks, who conquered Anatolia after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, brought a new set of cultural and religious dynamics to the region. The Turkish conquest gradually transformed Cappadocia from a predominantly Christian area to a predominantly Muslim one, but this transformation was not instantaneous. For several centuries, Christian and Muslim communities coexisted in the region, and both made use of the underground cities. Some scholars have suggested that certain modifications to the underground cities, the addition of new rooms, the expansion of existing corridors, changes to the ventilation system, date to the Seljuk period, when the cities may have been used for purposes beyond mere refuge, including trade, storage, and craft production. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century brought a new wave of devastation to Anatolia. The Mongol armies under the successors of Genghis Khan swept through the region with terrifying speed and violence, destroying cities, massacring populations, and leaving devastation in their wake. The underground cities almost certainly saw heavy use during this period, as the people of Cappadocia employed the same survival strategy that had served them for centuries, descending into the earth and waiting for the storm to pass. But somewhere at some point the underground cities were abandoned. The exact timing and circumstances of this abandonment are unclear, but by the Ottoman period, from roughly the 14th century onward, the underground cities appear to have fallen out of regular use. The Ottoman Empire, once established, brought a degree of stability and centralized authority to Anatolia that reduced the threat of invasion. The Ottoman military controlled the borders, maintained order in the interior, and provided a level of security that the peoples of Cappadocia had rarely enjoyed. With the threat of invasion diminished, the need for underground refuge diminished as well. The people of the region returned to the surface permanently, building new homes, new villages, new towns over the old entrances. The underground cities were gradually forgotten, their entrances sealed or hidden, their tunnels blocked by debris and collapsed ceilings, their existence passing out of living memory. It is a remarkable thing, the forgetting. A city that housed 20,000 people, carved from the living rock over centuries of labor, with 18 levels of rooms and corridors and churches and stables and wells and ventilation shafts, was simply forgotten. Within a few generations, the people living on the surface no longer knew what was beneath their feet. The entrances were in their basements, behind their walls, under their floors, and they had no idea. The knowledge was lost, the memory was erased, until a man knocked down a wall in his basement in 1963 and his chickens led him into the darkness. The rediscovery of Derinkuyu sparked immediate interest from archaeologists, historians, and the Turkish government. Excavation and exploration began almost immediately, though the sheer scale of the city meant that progress was slow and painstaking. Each level had to be carefully cleared of debris, documented, photographed, and analyzed. The structural integrity of the tunnels had to be assessed before researchers could safely descend to deeper levels. Water infiltration, which had partially flooded some of the lowest chambers, had to be managed. And the labyrinthine layout of the city, with its multiple corridors, its dead ends, its branching passages, and its deceptive similarities between different sections, made mapping a significant challenge. By the late 1960s, enough of the city had been explored and documented to open it to the public. Derinkuyu was designated a protected site by the Turkish Ministry of Culture, and visitors were allowed to descend into the upper levels of the city through controlled access points. The site quickly became one of the most popular tourist attractions in Cappadocia, drawing visitors from around the world who came to experience the extraordinary sensation of walking through a city carved from stone deep beneath the earth. Today, approximately half of Derinkuyu is accessible to visitors. The remaining levels, the deepest and least explored sections, remain closed, either because of structural concerns, ongoing archaeological work, or simple inaccessibility. Researchers believe that significant portions of the city remain unexplored, and new rooms and passages continue to be discovered as excavation progresses. In 2014, workers conducting urban renovation in a nearby town discovered another massive underground city, subsequently named the Nevşehir Underground City, which is believed to be even larger than Derinkuyu. This discovery suggests that the full extent of the underground network in Cappadocia is still unknown and may be far more extensive than currently understood. The question of how many people actually lived in Derinkuyu and for how long is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. The estimate of 20,000 is based on the total habitable volume of the city, calculated from room dimensions, corridor widths, and the number of sleeping platforms and storage areas identified by archaeologists. Some researchers consider this estimate too high, arguing that it assumes maximum occupancy with minimal personal space, conditions that would have been possible for a brief emergency but unsustainable for extended habitation. Others believe the estimate may actually be too low, pointing to unexplored levels and undiscovered rooms that could significantly increase the total habitable volume. The question of duration is similarly complex. The stored food capacity of the city, combined with its water supply from independent wells, could theoretically support a large population for several months. But the practical challenges of underground life, waste management, air quality, lighting, psychological stress, would have imposed limits on how long people could remain underground before the conditions became intolerable. Most scholars believe that the typical period of refuge was measured in days or weeks, not months or years. The population would descend when a specific threat materialized, remain underground until the threat passed, and return to the surface as quickly as possible. However, there may have been exceptional circumstances, prolonged sieges, extended military campaigns in the region, or periods of sustained civil unrest, when the underground population remained below for much longer. The presence of permanent infrastructure like churches, schools, and production facilities suggests that the builders anticipated the possibility of extended stays and designed the city to accommodate them. The physical experience of visiting Derinkuyu today offers a pale but still powerful echo of what life underground must have been like. Modern visitors enter through a reinforced entrance, descend concrete stairs, and walk through electrically lit corridors that have been widened in places to accommodate tourist traffic. The temperature drops noticeably as you descend from the warm surface air to the constant cool of the deep tunnels, a steady 55 degrees that feels almost cold after the heat of the Cappadocian summer. The rooms are smaller than you expect, the ceilings are lower, the corridors are narrower. Even with modern lighting, there is a sense of enclosure, of weight, of the earth pressing in from all sides. You duck through doorways carved for people shorter than the modern average. You squeeze through passages that seem barely wide enough for one person. You stand in the church on the 5th level and try to imagine it filled with worshippers, their faces lit by oil lamps, their voices echoing off the stone walls in prayer. You stand beside one of the massive stone doors and try to imagine rolling it into place, sealing yourself in, trusting the rock to protect you from whatever waits above. And then you emerge, blinking into the light, and you realize, with a visceral physical understanding that no amount of reading or study can provide, what it meant to live in this place. What it meant to choose darkness over danger, stone over sky, the weight of the earth over the sword of the invader. What it meant to be human in a world where survival demanded that you burrow into the ground like an animal and wait in the dark for the killing to stop. The engineering legacy of Derinkuyu extends beyond its own walls. The principles employed in its construction, passive ventilation, strategic compartmentalization, structural load distribution, water management, waste disposal, are principles that continue to inform modern underground architecture. Military bunkers, subway systems, underground research facilities, and even the underground cities being proposed for future human habitation on other planets draw on concepts that were first implemented, however intuitively, by the builders of Derinkuyu thousands of years ago. The city has also become a subject of intense interest for researchers in fields ranging from anthropology to psychology to environmental science. Anthropologists study Derinkuyu for what it reveals about social organization under extreme conditions, how communities maintain cohesion, distribute resources, manage conflict, and preserve culture when forced into confined, stressful environments. Psychologists are interested in the coping mechanisms that must have been necessary for prolonged underground living, the strategies for managing claustrophobia, maintaining morale, and preventing the social breakdown that can occur in isolated, enclosed communities. Environmental scientists study the city's ventilation and water systems for insights into passive climate control and natural air circulation that could be applied to modern green building design. As we near the conclusion of the first part of our exploration of Derinkuyu, let us return to the fundamental questions that have guided our journey. Who built this city? The answer, as we have seen, is not a single people but a succession of peoples: the Hatti, the Hittites, the Phrygians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Seljuks, the Ottomans, each adding to and modifying the work of their predecessors, each leaving their mark on the stone, each contributing to the slow, centuries-long creation of an underground world. Why was it built? The answer is survival. In a landscape defined by invasion, in a region where armies marched and counter-marched across the plains with devastating regularity, the people of Cappadocia developed a survival strategy uniquely suited to their geological environment. They went underground, they carved a world from stone, they created a place where they could hide, endure, and outlast the violence above. How was it built? The answer is human labor, applied with extraordinary skill and patience over generations. Simple tools, guided by sophisticated understanding of geology, engineering, and human needs, transformed raw volcanic tuff into a functioning city, a city with air, water, food production, defense, worship, education, and community. But the deepest question, the one that resonates most powerfully across the centuries, is not who or why or how. It is what. What does Derinkuyu tell us about ourselves? What does it reveal about the human capacity for ingenuity in the face of mortal danger? What does it say about our willingness to reshape the very earth beneath our feet in order to survive? Derinkuyu tells us that we are, at our core, survivors, that when the world above becomes too dangerous, we will find a way to create a world below, that when the light fails, we will bring our own. That when the surface is claimed by those who would destroy us, we will claim the depths, and there, in the silence and the darkness, we will endure. The underground city of Derinkuyu stands today as one of the most remarkable archaeological sites on Earth. It is a monument to human resilience, a testament to ancient engineering, and an enduring mystery. As excavation continues and new discoveries are made, our understanding of this extraordinary place deepens. But some questions may never be fully answered. The stone keeps its secrets, the darkness guards its history, and the ghosts of 20,000 people who lived and loved and prayed and survived in a city beneath the earth remain silent. In the second part of our exploration, we will delve deeper still, into the network of underground cities that connects Derinkuyu to the wider Cappadocian landscape, into the specific historical events that drove entire populations underground, into the remarkable parallels between Derinkuyu and other underground structures around the world, and into the haunting question that has fascinated researchers for decades. Why was this city, this masterpiece of human engineering, this fortress of survival, abandoned and forgotten, erased from memory as though it had never existed? The answers lie below, and we are going down. The people of Derinkuyu understood something that the modern world is only beginning to rediscover, that the earth itself can be a shelter, that the ground beneath our feet is not merely something to stand on but something to live in, something to be shaped and inhabited and defended. They understood that safety is not always found in height, in towers and walls and fortifications that rise above the landscape, but in depth, in the embrace of stone, in the cool, quiet darkness where no army can follow. The volcanic plains of central Anatolia stretch out beneath the Turkish sun, golden and dry, dotted with the strange mushroom-shaped pillars of the fairy chimneys, scarred by the deep valleys carved by ancient rivers. On the surface, the town of Derinkuyu looks like any other small Turkish town: modest houses, narrow streets, a mosque, a few shops, the quiet rhythms of rural life. There is nothing to suggest that beneath this ordinary surface lies an extraordinary world, a city of stone, a labyrinth of shadow, a monument to the undying human will to survive. But it is there. It has always been there, waiting in the dark, holding its breath, keeping its secrets. And if you listen carefully, if you press your ear to the ground and listen with more than your ears, you can almost hear it. The distant echo of footsteps, the murmur of voices, the steady drip of water from a well carved 2,000 years ago, the grinding of stone on stone as a half-ton door rolls across a corridor, sealing a world away from danger, the city beneath the earth, Derinkuyu. 18 stories of human defiance carved from the bones of an ancient volcano by hands that have been dust for centuries. It has waited this long, it can wait a little longer, but we cannot wait. There is more to tell, more to discover, more to understand about this place and the people who created it. The questions multiply even as the answers emerge. Each room that is uncovered, each corridor that is cleared, each artifact that is recovered raises new questions, opens new avenues of investigation, challenges old assumptions. Consider the logistical challenges of populating the underground city during an emergency. 20,000 people do not simply descend into a hole in the ground. They have to be organized, directed, managed. Someone has to decide when to retreat underground. Someone has to coordinate the movement of families, livestock, and supplies through the narrow entrances and corridors. Someone has to assign living spaces, manage the water distribution, organize the food supply, maintain order in the darkness. This implies governance. This implies leadership. This implies a social structure complex enough to manage a population the size of a small city under conditions of extreme stress. Who were these leaders? How were they chosen? What authority did they wield? Did the underground city have its own government, separate from whatever surface political structures existed? Were there laws specific to underground life, rationing rules, noise restrictions, protocols for waste disposal, procedures for settling disputes in the close quarters of the tunnels? We do not know. The stone tells us much about the physical infrastructure of Derinkuyu, but almost nothing about its social infrastructure. There are no written records from the underground city, no inscriptions, no documents, no archives carved into the walls. Whatever governance systems existed were maintained through oral tradition and practical necessity, and when the city was abandoned, that knowledge was lost. The defensive systems of Derinkuyu also raise questions about the nature of the threats the inhabitants faced. We have discussed the massive stone doors, the narrow corridors, the dead ends and false passages designed to confuse invaders. But there are other defensive features that suggest the builders were prepared for very specific types of attack. On several levels, archaeologists have identified small holes bored through the ceilings of corridors at strategic points. These holes are too small to serve as ventilation channels and too precisely positioned to be accidental. The leading theory is that they were murder holes, openings through which defenders on the level above could pour boiling oil, hot water, or other substances onto attackers in the corridor below. Similar features are found in medieval castles and fortifications throughout the world, but their presence in an underground city predating many of those castles by centuries is remarkable. There are also features that appear to be traps, sections of corridor where the floor drops unexpectedly, creating a step that would trip an attacker running in the dark, or where the ceiling suddenly lowers, forcing an attacker to crouch or crawl while defenders waited ahead. These features suggest that the builders were not just thinking about passive defense, sealing doors and waiting, but about active defense, about engaging intruders and inflicting casualties in the confined spaces of the tunnels. The question arises, did battles actually take place in the underground city? Were the stone doors ever breached? Did invaders ever penetrate below the first level and engage defenders in the corridors? The archaeological evidence is ambiguous. There are marks on some of the stone doors that could be damage from attempts to force them open, but they could also be natural wear or the result of the doors being moved during peacetime. There is no clear evidence of combat, no weapons embedded in walls, no skeletal remains in defensive positions, no burn marks from fires set in the corridors. This could mean that the defensive systems were so effective that they were never actually tested, that the mere existence of the underground city, with its hidden entrances and impenetrable doors, was sufficient deterrent. Or it could mean that any evidence of combat was cleaned up by the inhabitants after the emergency ended, the bodies removed, the weapons collected, the damage repaired. The role of women in the underground city is another subject that deserves consideration. Ancient and medieval societies in Anatolia were, by modern standards, patriarchal, with men occupying most positions of political and military authority. But in the underground city, the division of labor may have been different. Women would have been responsible for many of the essential functions of underground life: cooking, childcare, food preservation, textile production, and the maintenance of the living spaces. In a community where survival depended on the efficient management of limited resources, the skills and labor of women would have been indispensable. It is also possible that women played a more active role in the defense of the underground city than traditional gender roles might suggest. In the narrow corridors of Derinkuyu, physical strength was less important than determination, knowledge of the terrain, and the willingness to fight in close quarters. Women who knew the layout of the tunnels, who could navigate in the dark, who could operate the stone doors and use the murder holes, would have been effective defenders regardless of their physical size or strength. The children of Derinkuyu present a particularly poignant subject. Imagine growing up in a world where, periodically and without warning, you had to leave your home, descend into the earth, and live in darkness for days or weeks. Imagine the fear, the confusion, the sensory deprivation. And then imagine the resilience, the adaptability, the matter-of-fact acceptance of extraordinary circumstances that children are capable of. The school or meeting room on the 5th level, with its stone benches and its raised platform, tells us that the adults of Derinkuyu understood the importance of maintaining normalcy for children even in the most abnormal circumstances. Education continued underground, stories were told, lessons were taught, childhood, however disrupted, went on. The animals of Derinkuyu deserve mention as well. The stables on the 1st level could hold hundreds of animals: cattle, sheep, goats, donkeys, and possibly horses. Bringing livestock underground was essential for several reasons. First, the animals represented a significant economic investment. Losing your herd to raiders would be economically devastating. Second, the animals were a food source, not just for their meat, but for their milk, their eggs in the case of poultry, and their labor. Third, leaving animals on the surface would have revealed that the village was inhabited. Empty houses with livestock grazing in the fields would have told any invader that the people were hiding somewhere nearby. Managing livestock underground was a significant challenge. Animals need food, water, and space. They produce waste, noise, and heat. The stables had to be ventilated, cleaned, and maintained, and the animals had to be fed from the stored grain and fodder. The positioning of the stables on the uppermost level was a practical solution that minimized the impact on the living quarters below, but the logistics of maintaining a herd underground for an extended period were still formidable. Some researchers have suggested that the animals were not actually housed underground for extended periods, but were brought in only during the initial retreat, and then slaughtered within the first few days to provide meat for preservation. This would have reduced the ongoing burden of animal maintenance, but would have sacrificed the long-term milk and labor that living animals provided. The truth probably varied depending on the circumstances. Short emergencies might have seen the animals kept alive and returned to the surface quickly, while longer sieges might have necessitated slaughtering the herd for food. let us also consider the acoustic environment of Derinkuyu. Sound behaves differently underground than it does on the surface. In the tunnels and chambers of the underground city, sound echoes, reverberates, and carries in unpredictable ways. A conversation in one room might be clearly audible 2 corridors away. A child's cry might echo through an entire level. The grinding of a stone door might reverberate for hundreds of feet in every direction. For the inhabitants, this acoustic environment would have been both familiar and disorienting. The sounds of community life, voices, footsteps, cooking, praying, the bleating of goats, the crying of babies would have created a constant ambient soundscape that was, in its own way, reassuring. The complete silence that would descend when everyone was asleep, or when the community was listening intently for sounds from the surface, would have been equally powerful, a silence so deep, so complete, so absolute that it could be almost unbearable. For the defenders, the acoustic properties of the tunnels could be exploited. Sound carries well through stone corridors, and defenders listening at sealed doors could potentially hear attackers approaching from a considerable distance. Conversely, defenders could use sound to confuse intruders, creating echoes, making noises in distant corridors to draw attackers away from defended positions, or maintaining absolute silence to create an atmosphere of uncertainty and dread. As we conclude this first part of our exploration of Derinkuyu, let us step back and consider the underground city in its broadest context, not just as an archaeological site or an engineering marvel, but as a statement about the human condition. Derinkuyu was born from fear. It was built because people were afraid of armies, afraid of raiders, afraid of the violence that swept across the Anatolian landscape with brutal regularity. It was built because fear, when it is persistent enough and acute enough, drives human beings to extraordinary lengths. Fear of death made people dig through hundreds of feet of solid rock with nothing but hand tools. Fear of annihilation made entire communities relocate underground, surrendering sunlight, open air, and freedom of movement for the sake of survival. Fear carved churches in the stone so that people could pray in the darkness. Fear carved schools so that children could learn. Fear carved wineries and oil presses and kitchens and stables and wells, because fear, when it is lived with long enough, becomes a permanent condition, a background hum that shapes every decision, every structure, every aspect of daily life. But Derinkuyu was also born from hope, hope that the danger would pass, hope that the surface world would still be there when the stone doors opened, hope that the children born in the darkness would grow up in the light. Hope that the seeds stored in the underground granaries would be planted in the spring. Hope that the wine fermenting in the stone vats would be drunk at celebrations, not rationed in despair. Hope that the gods worshipped in the underground churches would hear the prayers rising through the ventilation shafts and deliver their people from evil. Fear and hope, the twin engines of human survival, they carved this city. They filled it with life. They sustained it across centuries and civilizations. And when the fear finally ebbed, when the invasions finally stopped, when the armies finally moved on, when the long Anatolian nightmare of conquest and reconquest finally ended, the hope that remained carried the people back to the surface, back to the light, back to a life where the sky was above them and the earth was beneath them and the world made sense again. And then they forgot the fear, they forgot the darkness. They forgot the underground city that had saved their ancestors' lives 100 times over. They built new houses over the old entrances. They raised new children who never knew the tunnels. They lived new lives that had no need for stone doors and ventilation shafts and wells that reached 300 feet into the earth, until a man knocked down a wall, and a city remembered. That is where we pause. That is where part one of our journey through Derinkuyu comes to rest, at the threshold between forgetting and remembering, between the darkness below and the light above, between the ancient world that built this impossible city and the modern world that is still trying to understand it. In part two, we will go deeper. We will explore the network of tunnels connecting Derinkuyu to other underground cities. We will examine the specific historical invasions that sent entire populations fleeing underground. We will investigate the mysterious abandonment of the city and the centuries of silence that followed. we will consider what Derinkuyu means for our understanding of human resilience, human engineering, and human courage. And we will ask the final, haunting question, in a world that seems, at times, no less dangerous than the one that created Derinkuyu, what can we learn from the people who carved a city from stone and survived in the heart of the earth? Beneath the golden plains of Cappadocia, beneath the fairy chimneys and the quiet towns and the endless Turkish sky, an ancient city waits in silence, 18 stories deep, carved from volcanic stone by hands that turned to dust centuries ago. A city that sheltered 20,000 souls from the horrors of the surface world, and then, without explanation, was sealed, abandoned, and erased from human memory. This is Derinkuyu, and we are going back down. In part 1, we descended into the underground city level by level. We explored its rooms and corridors, its churches and stables, its wineries and wells. We examined its astonishing engineering, the ventilation shafts that breathed life into the deepest chambers, the massive stone doors that could seal entire levels against invasion, the water systems that could be segmented to deny resources to an enemy. We asked who built this city, and we found not one answer but many, a succession of civilizations, each adding to the work of those who came before, each driven by the same desperate need to survive in one of the most violently contested landscapes in human history. Now in part 2, we go deeper still. We follow the tunnels that connect Derinkuyu to other underground cities miles away. We walk through the specific moments in history when entire populations vanished beneath the earth to escape the armies that swept across Anatolia like fire across dry grass. We examine the haunting mystery of the city's abandonment, why a masterpiece of survival engineering was simply left behind, forgotten, buried under centuries of silence. And we ask what Derinkuyu, this impossible city of stone and shadow, can teach us about who we are and what we are capable of when the world above becomes too dangerous to endure. The stone doors are open, the oil lamps are lit, the ventilation shafts are drawing cool air down from a sky we will not see for a long time. Let us descend. We begin with the tunnels, the long, dark arteries that connect Derinkuyu to the wider network of underground cities scattered across the Cappadocian landscape. Derinkuyu is not alone, it never was. It is one node in a vast subterranean web, a network of underground cities, passages, and refuges that stretches across hundreds of square miles of central Anatolia. More than 200 underground sites have been identified in the region, ranging from modest shelters with a handful of rooms to massive complexes that rival Derinkuyu in scale and sophistication. And connecting many of these sites, running beneath the surface of the plateau like the root system of some enormous stone tree, are tunnels, long, narrow passages carved through the volcanic tuff, linking city to city, community to community, refuge to refuge. The most famous of these connecting tunnels runs from Derinkuyu to Kaymakli, another major underground city located approximately 5 miles to the north. 5 miles underground through solid rock carved by hand. The existence of this tunnel has been confirmed by archaeologists, though only portions of it have been fully explored. Much of the passage is blocked by collapsed sections, accumulated sediment, and water infiltration that has made sections impassable without significant excavation. But enough of the tunnel has been documented to establish its reality and to confirm that it was a functional passage, not a natural formation, a deliberately carved corridor wide enough for a single person to walk through, with the same smooth walls, the same carved ventilation channels, and the same carefully maintained proportions found in the underground cities themselves. The implications of this tunnel are profound. If the people of Derinkuyu could reach Kaymakli underground, they were not trapped in a single location. If one city was compromised, if an enemy discovered its entrances, or if a structural collapse blocked key corridors, or if the food and water supply ran dangerously low, the population could evacuate through the connecting tunnel, emerging in a completely different city miles away. The invaders besieging Derinkuyu would have no idea that the people they were trying to starve out had simply walked away underground and surfaced 5 miles to the north, behind the enemy's lines in a completely different location. This changes our understanding of the underground cities from static shelters to a dynamic defensive network. The people of Cappadocia were not simply hiding, they were maneuvering. They were using the underground network the way a modern military uses tunnel systems and underground bunkers as secure lines of communication and movement that allow forces to shift position without being observed by the enemy. The surface belonged to the invaders, with their cavalry and their siege engines and their overwhelming numbers, but the underground belonged to the people of Cappadocia. Down there in the tunnels and chambers carved from the bones of ancient volcanoes, they were invisible, unreachable, untouchable. The connecting tunnels also suggest a level of inter-community cooperation and coordination that is remarkable for the ancient world. Building a 5-mile tunnel required not just the labor of Derinkuyu's population, but the coordinated effort of both Derinkuyu and Kaymakli. The two communities had to agree on the route, share the labor of excavation, coordinate the engineering so that the tunnel maintained a consistent grade and proper ventilation throughout its length, and establish protocols for its use during emergencies. This implies diplomatic relationships, mutual defense agreements, and a shared understanding of the threat environment that transcended individual community boundaries. Were there other tunnels connecting other cities? Almost certainly. Archaeologists have identified potential connecting passages at several other underground sites in the region, though most remain unexplored. The full extent of the underground network may never be known. Collapsed tunnels, flooded passages, and the sheer difficulty of underground exploration in remote areas of the Anatolian plateau mean that many connections may remain hidden indefinitely. But the evidence that does exist paints a picture of a subterranean world far more extensive and far more interconnected than the individual underground cities suggest. Let us now turn our attention to Kaymakli itself, the sister city of Derinkuyu, and the other major underground complexes of Cappadocia. Kaymakli is the second most famous underground city in the region, and in some respects it is even more accessible and better documented than Derinkuyu. Located beneath the modern town of the same name, Kaymakli has 8 confirmed levels, though archaeologists believe it extends deeper. Like Derinkuyu, it was carved from the volcanic tuff of the Cappadocian plateau, and it shares many of the same features: narrow defensive corridors, massive rolling stone doors, ventilation shafts, wells, storage rooms, living quarters, and spaces for worship and community gathering. But Kaymakli has its own distinctive character. The layout of the city is different from Derinkuyu's, more horizontal than vertical, with broader rooms and wider corridors on some levels. The living spaces in Kaymakli tend to be larger and more open, suggesting that the community that used this city may have had different social structures or different expectations for underground life. The storage capacity is enormous, with vast rooms that could have held enough grain, oil, and wine to sustain thousands of people for months. And the stables in Kaymakli are particularly well developed, with elaborate feeding troughs, drainage channels for waste, and even carved rings in the walls for tethering animals, features that suggest the community kept large herds and considered livestock management a priority during underground retreats. Kaymakli also has one of the most impressive kitchen complexes found in any of the underground cities. Multiple cooking areas, each with its own ventilation system for smoke removal, are arranged around communal dining spaces large enough for dozens of people to eat together. The blackened ceilings of these kitchens testify to centuries of use, and the grinding stones and storage vessels found in adjacent rooms tell us that flour was milled, bread was baked, and meals were prepared underground with the same care and routine that characterized surface life. The relationship between Kaymakli and Derinkuyu is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Were they rival communities, separate villages that happened to share an underground defense strategy? Were they complementary, with each city serving a different function within a coordinated defensive system? or were they effectively a single community, with populations moving freely between the two cities through the connecting tunnel, choosing their location based on the direction from which the threat was approaching? There is some evidence to support the last interpretation. The geographical positioning of the two cities, 5 miles apart on a roughly north-south axis, would have allowed a population to choose its refuge based on the direction of an approaching army. An army coming from the south would be met by the empty surface village of Derinkuyu, while the population sheltered safely underground in Kaymakli to the north. An army coming from the north would encounter an abandoned Kaymakli while the population waited in Derinkuyu to the south. And if the situation was truly dire, if armies were approaching from multiple directions, both cities could be occupied simultaneously, with the connecting tunnel allowing communication, resource sharing, and mutual support. This is speculation, of course. We cannot know with certainty how the two cities were used in coordination. But the mere existence of the connecting tunnel tells us that coordination existed, that the communities of Derinkuyu and Kaymakli were not isolated from each other, and that the underground defense network was more sophisticated than a simple collection of independent hiding places. Beyond Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, the Cappadocian landscape is studded with underground sites of varying size and complexity. Volcanic, located about 50 miles to the northeast, is a smaller underground city with 10 levels that was discovered in 1972 by a local farmer who noticed that his irrigation water was disappearing into the ground through a mysterious hole. Investigation revealed the hole to be a ventilation shaft for an underground city that had been unknown and forgotten for centuries. Volcanic has its own distinctive defensive features, including communication holes bored through the floors between levels that allowed inhabitants to speak to each other across multiple stories, and channels cut above doorways that were designed to pour hot oil or other deterrents onto attackers. Mazi, another underground settlement located about 18 miles southeast of Derinkuyu, is notable for its enormous size and its multiple surface entrances, some carved into cliff faces, others hidden in the floors of buildings, still others concealed beneath boulders and rock outcroppings. The Mazi underground complex extends beneath the entire village and may be one of the largest underground sites in the region, though much of it remains unexplored. Tatlarin, a smaller but remarkably well-preserved underground city, contains some of the finest examples of carved religious spaces in the entire underground network. A Byzantine-era church on one of the upper levels features carved columns, arched ceilings, and what appear to be the remains of painted frescoes, pigments applied to the smooth stone walls depicting religious scenes. The preservation of these paintings in the underground environment, protected from the weathering and vandalism that destroyed so many surface frescoes, offers a rare glimpse into the artistic traditions of the communities that used these spaces. And then there is the discovery that shook the archaeological world in 2014, the Nevşehir underground city. During an urban renewal project in the city of Nevşehir, the provincial capital, construction workers uncovered the entrance to what appears to be the largest underground city ever found. Initial surveys suggest that the Nevşehir site may extend across an area of approximately 460,000 square meters, nearly 114 acres, and may contain chambers, corridors, and passages at depths comparable to or exceeding Derinkuyu. The discovery is still being investigated, and full excavation has barely begun, but preliminary estimates suggest that the Nevşehir underground city could be significantly larger than Derinkuyu and Kaymakli combined. The Nevşehir discovery underscores a humbling reality. We may have only scratched the surface, both literally and figuratively, of the underground world beneath Cappadocia. For every city that has been discovered and explored, there may be others that remain hidden, sealed behind collapsed tunnels and forgotten entrances, waiting for a farmer's plow or a construction crew's backhoe to break through into their silent chambers. How many people, across how many centuries, lived in these underground cities? The question is almost impossible to answer with precision, but we can make some informed estimates. If Derinkuyu alone could shelter 20,000 people, and if Kaymakli had a comparable capacity, and if the dozens of smaller underground cities in the region each housed populations ranging from a few hundred to several thousand, the total sheltering capacity of the Cappadocian underground network was enormous, potentially 50,000 people or more. During major invasions, when entire provinces fled before the advancing enemy, these underground cities would have been filled to capacity, every room occupied, every corridor packed, every well and granary drawn upon to sustain a population in crisis. The total number of people who used the underground cities over the course of their active history, spanning perhaps 2,000 years from the Phrygian period to the Ottoman conquest, is incalculable. Millions of individual experiences, millions of descents into darkness, millions of moments of fear and relief and boredom and prayer and hunger and thirst and hope, each one unrecorded, each one lost to history. The stone remembers the shape of the rooms but not the names of the people who slept in them. The ventilation shafts still draw air, but the voices that once echoed through them have been silent for centuries. Let us now walk through some of the specific historical events that drove the people of Cappadocia underground, not as abstract references to invasions and raids, but as lived experiences, as moments of crisis that tested the underground cities and the people who depended on them. We begin in the 8th century before the Common Era with the Cimmerian invasions. The Cimmerians were a nomadic people from the steppes north of the Black Sea, fierce, mobile, mounted warriors who swept into Anatolia around 700 before the Common Era. They came not to settle but to plunder, and their raids were devastating. The Phrygian kingdom, which dominated central Anatolia at the time, bore the brunt of the Cimmerian onslaught. The Phrygian capital at Gordium was sacked and burned. King Midas, the same Midas of the Golden Touch legend, or at least the historical figure behind the myth, is said to have killed himself rather than face capture. The Phrygian heartland was ravaged, its cities destroyed, its population scattered. For the common people of the Phrygian countryside, the farmers, the herders, the village dwellers, the Cimmerian raids were a matter of survival. The Cimmerian cavalry could cover vast distances in a day, appearing without warning and striking with overwhelming speed. There was no time to flee to fortified cities, no opportunity to assemble armies. The only option was to disappear, and the underground refuges of Cappadocia, whether already in existence or begun during this period of crisis, offered the means to do exactly that. Did the people of the Phrygian villages descend into early versions of Derinkuyu and Kaymakli during the Cimmerian raids? We cannot know for certain, but the timing is suggestive. The Phrygian period is the earliest period to which many scholars attribute the initial excavation of the underground cities, and the Cimmerian invasion provides a compelling motivation. The first levels of Derinkuyu, the stables, the storage rooms, the basic living quarters, may have been carved in desperate response to the Cimmerian threat, simple underground shelters that would later be expanded and refined by subsequent generations into the elaborate cities we see today. The Persian conquest of Anatolia in the 6th century before the Common Era brought a different kind of change to Cappadocia. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great, and later under Darius and Xerxes, absorbed Cappadocia into the vast administrative structure of the Achaemenid state. Persian rule was not necessarily destructive. The Persians were generally tolerant administrators who allowed local customs and religions to continue as long as taxes were paid and loyalty maintained. But Persian rule brought Persian conflicts, and Cappadocia found itself drawn into the wars between Persia and Greece that dominated the 5th century before the Common Era. The Persian satrapy of Cappadocia may have been relatively stable, but the region was not immune to unrest. Local rebellions, succession disputes, and the passage of Persian armies marching westward toward Greece or eastward toward Central Asia would have periodically disrupted life on the Cappadocian plateau. And the Persian period may also have seen the introduction of Zoroastrian religious practices into the underground cities. As we discussed in Part 1, fire rituals conducted in subterranean chambers, ceremonies carried out in the quiet, enclosed spaces that were so different from the open-air fire temples of the Persian heartland. The Macedonian conquest under Alexander the Great in the 4th century, before the Common Era, passed through Anatolia like a thunderbolt. Alexander's army swept across the peninsula in 333 before the Common Era, defeating the Persian forces at the Battle of Issus and pressing onward toward Egypt and the heart of the Persian Empire. Cappadocia, however, was not easily subdued. The region's rugged terrain and its tradition of resistance made it one of the last parts of Anatolia to come fully under Macedonian control. Alexander himself did not campaign extensively in Cappadocia, delegating the task to his generals. The region remained semi-independent under local rulers for decades after Alexander's death, a testament to the stubbornness of its people and the difficulty of projecting military power into the heartland of the Anatolian plateau. During this period of uncertainty and conflict, the underground cities would have been valuable assets. The power struggles among Alexander's successors, the wars of the Diadochi, brought armies marching and counter-marching across Anatolia for decades, each general staking a claim to part of the fractured Macedonian Empire. For the people of Cappadocia, caught between rival warlords, the safest place was underground. The Roman absorption of Cappadocia, which occurred gradually over the 1st century before the Common Era, and was formalized in 17 of the Common Era when the Emperor Tiberius made Cappadocia a Roman province, brought relative stability to the region. Roman roads, Roman garrisons, and the Pax Romana provided a level of security that Cappadocia had rarely enjoyed. The underground cities may have seen reduced use during this period, though they were certainly maintained and possibly expanded. Roman-era artifacts found in several underground sites suggest continued habitation, or at least continued use for storage and shelter. But the Roman peace was not eternal, and the borders of the Roman Empire were never truly secure. The eastern frontier, which ran through the mountains and plains of eastern Anatolia, was a constant zone of conflict between Rome and the Parthian Empire, and later between Rome and the Sassanid Persians. Military campaigns in the east brought armies through Cappadocia with regularity, and the disruptions associated with these campaigns, requisitioned supplies, forced labor, pillaging by undisciplined soldiers, would have given the people of the region ample reason to maintain their underground refuges. The crisis of the 3rd century, the period of political, military, and economic turmoil that nearly destroyed the Roman Empire between roughly 235 and 284 of the Common Era, brought new threats to Cappadocia. Sassanid Persian armies invaded Anatolia multiple times during this period, culminating in the catastrophic defeat and capture of the Roman Emperor Valerian by the Sassanid king Shapur I in 260. The Sassanid invasion of the 260s devastated large parts of eastern and central Anatolia, and the people of Cappadocia would have retreated underground in significant numbers to escape the destruction. But it was the Arab invasions of the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries that marked the most intensive and prolonged period of use for the underground cities. The rise of Islam in the 7th century transformed the political and military landscape of the entire Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean. Arab armies, united by the new faith and led by brilliant military commanders, burst out of the Arabian Peninsula with a speed and force that astonished the world. Within a few decades, they had conquered the Sassanid Persian Empire, seized Egypt and North Africa from the Byzantines, and pushed into the heartland of Anatolia, threatening the Byzantine capital of Constantinople itself. For the Christian communities of Cappadocia, the Arab invasions were an existential crisis. The raids were not occasional incursions but regular, almost annual affairs. Arab armies would cross the Taurus Mountains into Anatolia every spring, raid deep into Byzantine territory, and withdraw before winter. These campaigns, known in Arabic sources as the summer raids, were designed to weaken the Byzantine Empire, plunder its resources, and expand the territory under Muslim control. The targets of these raids were not just military installations, but civilian populations, farms, villages, towns, monasteries, churches. The pattern was terrifyingly predictable. Each spring, the watchers on the mountain passes would spot the dust clouds of the approaching Arab cavalry. The warning would spread across the plateau, carried by riders, by smoke signals, by the ringing of church bells, and the people of Cappadocia would descend. They would gather their families, collect their livestock, load their supplies, and vanish underground, sealing the stone doors behind them and praying that the raiders would pass without discovering their hiding places. The underground cities were tested during these decades as they had never been tested before. The Arab raids were not brief, one-time events, but sustained campaigns lasting weeks or months. The raiding parties were large, well-organized, and thorough in their search for plunder. The risk of discovery was real and constant, and the stakes were as high as they could possibly be. Capture by the raiders meant enslavement, forced conversion, or death. It was during this period that many of the features we associate with Derinkuyu were either built or significantly expanded. The churches on the lower levels, the cruciform church on the 5th level, the chapels and prayer niches scattered throughout the city date primarily to this era. The Christian communities of Cappadocia were creating sacred spaces underground, places where they could worship in secret, maintain their religious identity, and seek spiritual comfort in the face of mortal danger. The carved crosses, the baptismal fonts, the altar niches, the icon stands, all of these were expressions of faith in the most literal sense, carved into the living rock by people who believed that their God would protect them in the darkness. The school or meeting room on the 5th level may also date to this period. If the underground refuges were being used for weeks or months at a time during the Arab raids, the need for organized education, community decision-making, and cultural preservation would have been acute. Children had to be taught, decisions had to be made, stories had to be told, traditions had to be maintained. The underground city was not just a shelter, it was a preservation vessel for an entire culture under threat. The specific experience of an Arab raid, as it would have been lived by the inhabitants of Derinkuyu, can be reconstructed from a combination of Byzantine historical sources, archaeological evidence, and informed speculation. The warning would come first, perhaps a rider from the east, exhausted and dust-covered, shouting that the Arab cavalry had been spotted crossing the Taurus passes. Or perhaps the signal fires lit on the hilltops in a relay system that could carry a message across 100 miles in minutes, plumes of smoke by day, flames by night, each one saying the same thing: they are coming. The response was immediate and practiced. The village headman, or perhaps a council of elders or the local priest, would give the order. Every family knew what to do. They had done it before. Their parents had done it before them. The emergency supplies stored in accessible locations throughout the village were gathered. Sacks of grain, jars of oil, bundles of dried meat and fruit, skins of water, blankets, tools, weapons, oil for lamps, flint for fire, medicine, rope. Everything needed to sustain life underground for weeks. The livestock were rounded up, not easy work with panicked animals and frightened children, but accomplished with the efficiency of long practice. The goats were herded into lines, the sheep followed. The cattle were led by their noserings. The donkeys, loaded with supplies, picked their way down the narrow entrance ramps into the stable level. The poultry, carried in baskets, squawked and fluttered. The people followed. Family by family, group by group, they descended into the earth. The elderly were helped by the young. The sick were carried on litters. Pregnant women moved carefully down the narrow stairs, one hand on the wall, one hand on their bellies. Mothers carried infants. Fathers carried older children on their shoulders. Everyone carried something. The entrance was the last point of vulnerability. Until the stone door was sealed, anyone standing at the entrance was exposed. Lookouts posted on nearby hilltops watched for the approaching dust cloud, estimating the time remaining, relaying information to the entrance guards. The last people to enter were the rear guard, young men armed with whatever weapons were available, whose job was to ensure that everyone was inside before they themselves descended and rolled the great stone door into place. The grinding of stone on stone, the thud of the door settling into its channel, the click of the locking mechanism, and then silence. Or rather, the sounds of 20,000 people trying to be quiet, the hushed voices, the muffled coughs, the whimpering of frightened children, the restless shifting of animals in their stalls. Above, on the surface, the village sat empty. Doors stood open. Fires still smoldered in hearths. Tools lay where they had been dropped. The only signs of life were the scattered tracks in the dust, converging on the hidden entrances, disappearing into the ground. When the Arab cavalry arrived, perhaps hours later, perhaps days, they found a ghost village. Empty houses, abandoned fields, no people, no livestock, no valuables. The raiders might search the houses, take whatever remained, iron tools, pottery, furniture, anything portable and useful. They might set fires, burning roofs and wooden structures out of frustration or as a matter of course. They might spend a day or 2 or 3 resting their horses, foraging in the abandoned fields, sending scouts to search for the missing population. But the people were gone, vanished, as completely and thoroughly as if the earth had swallowed them, which of course it had. The duration of the underground stay depended on the nature of the threat. A small raiding party, passing through quickly on its way to more lucrative targets, might move on within a day or 2. The scouts peering through the small holes in the stone doors would report the departure, and the community would emerge cautiously, checking for stragglers, assessing the damage, beginning repairs. But a major campaign, a large army settling into the region for an extended operation, could keep the population underground for weeks. During these prolonged stays, the routines of underground life became critical. Water had to be rationed carefully. Food had to be distributed equitably. Cooking fires had to be managed to prevent smoke buildup. Waste had to be collected and disposed of. Livestock had to be fed and watered. Medical needs had to be addressed, injuries, illnesses, the inevitable births and deaths that occurred during extended stays. The psychological pressure of prolonged underground habitation cannot be overstated. Imagine spending 3 weeks in a room 8 feet by 10 feet with no natural light, no fresh air beyond what the ventilation shafts provided, no knowledge of what was happening on the surface, no way to communicate with the outside world. Imagine the claustrophobia, the boredom, the tension, the fear. Imagine the arguments that would erupt in close quarters, disputes over food, over space, over noise, over the 1,000 small irritations that become unbearable when magnified by confinement and stress. Imagine the children, frightened, restless, unable to understand why they could not go outside, why they had to be quiet, why the world had shrunk to this small, dark room. And then imagine the relief of emergence, the stone door rolling back, the rush of warm surface air carrying the scents of dust and grass and wood smoke, the first glimpse of sky blue, impossibly blue after weeks of stone ceilings, the sunlight so bright it hurt, making you squint and shield your eyes, the tears. Prayers of thanksgiving, the children running out into the open, screaming with joy, rolling in the dirt, staring at the sky as though they had never seen it before. And then the assessment, the damage, the burned roofs, the looted storerooms, the trampled fields, the knowledge that everything had to be rebuilt, replanted, repaired again. And the deeper knowledge, the one that lived in the bones and never went away, that it would happen again. Next spring or next summer or next month, the riders would come again. The dust clouds would rise again, the stone doors would close again. This cycle of raid, retreat, endurance, and recovery continued for roughly 2 centuries, from the mid-7th century to the mid-9th century, before the Byzantine Empire managed to stabilize its eastern frontier and reduce the frequency and severity of the Arab incursions. During this period, the underground cities of Cappadocia were not just shelters, but the foundations of community survival. The entire social, economic, and religious life of the region was organized around the reality of periodic underground retreat. Farms were designed with quick evacuation in mind. Storage systems were maintained with underground provisions always ready. Social hierarchies included roles specifically related to underground operations, entrance guards, water managers, food distributors, scouts, rear guards. The end of the major Arab raids in the 9th and 10th centuries brought a gradual shift in the use of the underground cities. The immediate military threat diminished, and the population began to spend more time on the surface and less time underground. But the cities were not abandoned. They continued to be used for storage, for worship, for shelter during lesser threats and local conflicts. The tradition of underground habitation was too deeply ingrained, the infrastructure too valuable to be simply discarded. The Seljuk Turks arrived in Anatolia in the 11th century, and their victory over the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 opened the door to the Turkish settlement of the Anatolian interior. The Seljuk conquest was not a single, devastating invasion, but a gradual process of settlement and assimilation that unfolded over decades. Turkish nomads moved into the highlands of central Anatolia, establishing villages, founding towns, and blending with the existing Greek-speaking Christian population. For the underground cities, the Seljuk period brought complex changes. The new Turkish settlers, many of them former nomads accustomed to life on the open steppe, did not share the Cappadocian tradition of underground habitation. But they quickly recognized the value of the underground spaces for storage, for shelter from the extreme Anatolian climate, and for defense against the many threats that still plagued the region: bandits, rival Turkish factions, crusader armies passing through on their way to the Holy Land, and the ever-present risk of Mongol invasion from the east. Evidence from this period suggests that the underground cities were used by both Christian and Muslim communities, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes sequentially. The religious spaces within the cities, the churches, the chapels, the prayer niches, were modified or supplemented by new spaces designed for Islamic worship. This religious coexistence underground mirrors the broader pattern of interfaith relations in Seljuk Anatolia, where Christians and Muslims lived side by side in a complex, sometimes tense, sometimes remarkably harmonious relationship. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century brought the underground cities back to their original purpose: emergency shelter against overwhelming military force. The Mongol armies were unlike anything the peoples of Anatolia had ever faced. Fast, disciplined, ruthlessly efficient, and utterly without mercy, the Mongol cavalry swept across the Middle East and into Anatolia with a speed that defied comprehension. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, weakened by internal divisions, was unable to mount an effective defense. The Battle of Kurstag in 1243 ended in a devastating Seljuk defeat, and the Mongols became the dominant power in Anatolia. For the civilian population, the Mongol conquest was a catastrophe. The Mongol armies did not distinguish between military and civilian targets. Cities were sacked, populations massacred, agricultural lands devastated. The famous Mongol practice of piling the skulls of the slain into pyramids outside conquered cities was a deliberate terror tactic designed to break the will of resistance before it could form. In the face of such overwhelming and indiscriminate violence, the underground cities of Cappadocia became, once again, essential survival infrastructure. The Mongol period may represent the last major episode of intensive underground shelter use in Cappadocia. The Mongol threat was prolonged, lasting decades, not weeks, and the underground populations would have been under extraordinary pressure. Resources would have been stretched thin. The infrastructure would have been tested to its limits. And the psychological toll of living underground for months at a time, with the knowledge that the most destructive military force in history was operating on the surface above, must have been immense. And then came the Ottomans. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the 14th and 15th centuries gradually brought order to the chaos of post-Mongol Anatolia. The Ottomans were empire builders, not raiders. They were interested in taxation, administration, and long-term control, not plunder and destruction. Under Ottoman rule, Cappadocia became a quiet provincial backwater, stable, prosperous in a modest way, and largely free from the constant threat of invasion that had defined the region's history for millennia. It was under Ottoman rule that the underground cities were finally, gradually abandoned, not all at once, not by decree, but slowly over generations as the need for underground refuge diminished and the knowledge of how to maintain and use the underground infrastructure was lost. The entrances were sealed, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally, as buildings were constructed over them or as natural processes filled them with debris. The tunnels collapsed in places. Water seeped into the lower levels, flooding chambers that had been dry for centuries. The stone doors, unmoved for decades, settled into their channels and became fixed in place, and the memory faded. The grandparents who had lived through the last emergency retreats died, and their stories died with them. The parents who had heard those stories told them less and less frequently. The children who grew up in Ottoman peace had no framework for understanding the underground cities, no experience of the fear that had built them, no reason to maintain knowledge that seemed to have no practical value. Within a few generations, the underground cities passed from lived experience to fading legend to complete oblivion. The forgetting is, in some ways, as remarkable as the building. How does a community forget a city beneath its feet? How do you lose the knowledge of 18 levels of rooms and corridors, of wells and ventilation shafts, of churches and stables and schools? How do you walk over the ground every day of your life and not know what is beneath you? The answer, perhaps, is that forgetting was a form of healing. The underground cities were born from trauma, from the terror of invasion, the fear of annihilation, the desperate need to survive. When the trauma ended, when the invasion stopped and the peace held and the fear finally lifted, the people of Cappadocia did what traumatized populations often do. They moved on, they looked forward. They built new lives on the surface and left the darkness behind. The underground cities became associated with a past that no one wanted to remember, a past of fear, of hiding, of powerlessness. Forgetting them was a way of asserting that those days were over, that the world had changed, that the future was above, not below. But the earth remembers what people forget. And in 1963, a wall came down, a passage opened, and the city beneath the earth was found again. The rediscovery of Derinkuyu was, as we discussed in Part 1, initially accidental, a homeowner renovating his basement, a hidden room, a passage into darkness. But the subsequent exploration and excavation were deliberate, systematic, and revelatory. Turkish archaeologists, working with international colleagues, spent decades mapping the accessible portions of the city, documenting its features, analyzing its construction, and dating its various components through a combination of pottery analysis, architectural comparison, and where possible, radiocarbon dating of organic materials found within the chambers. The process was slow and sometimes frustrating. The underground environment, while excellent for preserving stone architecture, was less kind to organic materials. Wood, textiles, leather, food, remains, the kinds of artifacts that provide the richest information about daily life, had largely disintegrated over the centuries. Metal artifacts were rare, either because the inhabitants took their valuables with them when they abandoned the city or because the underground conditions accelerated corrosion. Pottery was the most common artifact type, and while pottery analysis can provide valuable information about chronology and cultural affiliation, it cannot tell us the names, the stories, the individual human experiences of the people who lived underground. The exploration also revealed that Derinkuyu was far larger than initially estimated. As researchers cleared debris, opened sealed passages, and probed deeper into the rock, they found new rooms, new corridors, new levels that had not been visible during the initial surveys. The city seemed to expand with each new expedition, as though it were revealing itself gradually, showing one more room, one more passage, one more secret with each visit. Even today, archaeologists believe that significant portions of Derinkuyu remain unexplored, rooms behind collapsed corridors, levels below the current water table, passages that branch off in directions that have not yet been followed. The ventilation shafts, in particular, have proven to be important avenues of exploration. By lowering cameras and sensors down the vertical shafts, researchers have been able to identify chambers and spaces at depths that are not yet accessible through the horizontal corridors. Some of these deep spaces appear to be large, open chambers with high ceilings and smooth walls, suggesting that the lowest levels of Derinkuyu may contain rooms of a different character from the cramped living quarters of the upper levels. What purpose these deep rooms served remains unknown. The question of what lies at the very bottom of Derinkuyu, beneath the 18th confirmed level, below the deepest explored chambers, is one of the most tantalizing mysteries in modern archaeology. Is there a 19th level, a 20th? Is there a chamber at the very base of the city that served some special purpose, a treasury, a sanctuary, a place of last resort? Or does the city simply end, the tunnels narrowing to nothing as the rock becomes too hard or the water table too high for further excavation? We do not know. The deepest portions of the city are flooded, and pumping out the water would be a massive engineering undertaking that could potentially destabilize the rock and cause collapses in the levels above. The Turkish government, understandably cautious about a site that supports a significant tourism industry and is surrounded by a living town, has not authorized deep pumping operations. The lowest levels of Derinkuyu remain, for now, as inaccessible as they were when the city was first sealed centuries ago. Some researchers have proposed using ground-penetrating radar, sonar, and other non-invasive technologies to probe the flooded depths without actually draining them. These technologies have been used successfully at other archaeological sites, and they could potentially reveal the extent and layout of the lowest levels without the risks associated with physical excavation. Such surveys have been proposed, but as of the most recent available information, have not been comprehensively conducted. The deepest secrets of Derinkuyu remain locked beneath the water table, waiting for a future generation of researchers with better tools and more resources. Let us now broaden our perspective and consider Derinkuyu in the context of underground construction around the world. Is Derinkuyu unique, or is it part of a broader human tradition of subterranean habitation? The answer is both. Derinkuyu is unique in its specific combination of depth, scale, and sophistication. No other known underground city matches its 18 levels, its estimated capacity of 20,000 people, or its integrated system of ventilation, water supply, defense, and community infrastructure. In this respect, Derinkuyu stands alone, the deepest and most complex underground city ever built by human hands. But the impulse to go underground, to seek shelter, safety, and sustenance beneath the surface of the earth, is as old as humanity itself. From the earliest cave dwellings of our prehistoric ancestors to the elaborate tunnel systems of modern military installations, human beings have always recognized the protective potential of the subterranean world. The catacombs of Rome, carved beneath the streets of the imperial capital, served as burial places and during periods of persecution as meeting spaces for the early Christian community. The catacombs extend for hundreds of miles beneath the modern city, and their labyrinthine passages share certain features with the tunnels of Derinkuyu: narrow corridors, carved niches, chambers for worship, and the pervasive sense of a hidden world existing in parallel with the surface city above. The underground cities of Lalibela in Ethiopia, where 11 medieval churches were carved directly from the living rock in the 12th and 13th centuries, represent a different but related tradition of subterranean construction. The Lalibela churches are not underground cities in the Derinkuyu sense. They are religious monuments, carved downward from the surface rather than excavated into the earth, but they demonstrate the same fundamental human willingness to reshape the rock itself in service of spiritual and community needs. The Kukai tunnels in Vietnam, constructed during the 20th century as part of the resistance against foreign military forces, are perhaps the closest modern parallel to Derinkuyu. The Kukai tunnel network extended for over 150 miles, with multiple levels, living quarters, kitchens, hospitals, and command centers. Like Derinkuyu, the Kukai tunnels were designed for concealment and defense, with narrow passages, hidden entrances, booby traps, and ventilation systems that dispersed smoke and odors over wide areas to avoid detection. The people who lived in the Kukai tunnels faced many of the same challenges as the people of Derinkuyu: air quality, water supply, waste management, psychological stress, and they developed similar solutions, adapted to the different geological and technological context of 20th century Southeast Asia. The comparison between Derinkuyu and the Kukai tunnels is instructive because it demonstrates that the underground survival strategy is not limited to a single time, place, or culture. When faced with overwhelming military force on the surface, populations throughout history and around the world have made the same choice: to go underground, to become invisible, to endure in the darkness until the threat passes. The specific engineering solutions vary, but the fundamental strategy is the same. And the human qualities required: patience, resilience, ingenuity, courage, the willingness to endure extreme discomfort for the sake of survival, are universal. There are other parallels worth noting. The underground grain storage facilities of the ancient Nabateans in Jordan, the same people who carved the famous city of Petra from sandstone cliffs, demonstrate that underground construction for survival purposes was widespread in the ancient Middle East. The Nabatean storage silos, carved deep into the rock beneath the desert floor, could hold enough grain to sustain the population through years of drought, and their hidden locations made them difficult for raiders to find and plunder. The Qanat systems of ancient Persia, underground aqueducts that carried water from mountain sources to lowland settlements through miles of hand-carved tunnels, represent another tradition of subterranean engineering that may have influenced the construction of Derinkuyu. The Persian Qanat builders developed sophisticated techniques for tunnel ventilation, structural support, and water management that would have been directly applicable to underground city construction. Given that Persia controlled Cappadocia for several centuries, it is possible that Persian engineering knowledge contributed to the development of the underground cities. The Saudi reigns of Iron Age Europe, underground passages and chambers found throughout the British Isles, France, and other parts of Western Europe, are smaller and simpler than Derinkuyu but serve a similar function. These underground structures, dating from roughly the first millennium before the Common Era, were used for storage, shelter, and possibly defense. Their widespread distribution across multiple cultures and regions suggests that underground construction was a common survival strategy in the ancient world, developed independently by different peoples in response to similar threats. And then there are the modern examples, the vast underground complexes built by governments around the world during the 20th century to shelter leaders and military command structures from nuclear attack. These modern bunkers, with their blast doors, air filtration systems, water recycling plants, and communication networks, are in many ways the direct descendants of Derinkuyu. The engineering is more sophisticated, the technology more advanced, the threats more apocalyptic, but the fundamental concept is the same. When the surface becomes too dangerous, go underground, seal the doors, wait it out, survive. The cultural impact of Derinkuyu extends far beyond archaeology and engineering. The underground city has become a powerful symbol, a metaphor for resilience, for hidden strength, for the ability to endure beneath the surface when the world above is hostile. In Turkish culture, Derinkuyu and the other underground cities of Cappadocia are sources of national pride and fascination. They represent a deep, ancient stratum of the country's history, a history that predates the arrival of the Turks in Anatolia by thousands of years, but that the modern Turkish state has embraced as part of its shared heritage. The underground cities are featured in Turkish school curricula, tourism campaigns, and cultural programming. They are symbols of the enduring human presence in Anatolia, reminders that the land has been continuously inhabited for millennia, and that its history is far richer and more complex than any single civilization or era. For the international community, Derinkuyu has become a touchstone for discussions about ancient technology, human ingenuity, and the potential for underground habitation in the future. As concerns about climate change, resource depletion, and urbanization drive interest in alternative forms of habitation, the underground cities of Cappadocia are frequently cited as examples of how large populations can live sustainably below the surface. The natural temperature regulation of the underground environment, the potential for geothermal energy extraction, the protection from extreme weather events, these are features that modern architects and urban planners are beginning to explore, inspired in part by the ancient precedent of Derinkuyu. The tourism industry surrounding Derinkuyu and the other underground cities of Cappadocia has grown enormously since the initial rediscovery in the 1960s. Millions of visitors from around the world travel to Cappadocia each year, drawn by the region's unique landscape, its rich history, and the opportunity to descend into an ancient underground city and experience, even briefly, what life was like beneath the surface. The tourist experience of Derinkuyu is, inevitably, a compressed and sanitized version of the reality. Visitors walk through electrically lit corridors on paved paths, with informational signs and guided tour explaining the features of each level. The temperature is comfortable, the air quality is excellent, the exits are clearly marked. The sense of confinement and darkness that defined underground life is only faintly suggested, a brief tightening of the corridors, a moment when you have to duck through a low doorway, a fleeting awareness of the weight of rock above your head. But even this sanitized experience can be powerful. Visitors often report a visceral, emotional response to being underground, a mix of fascination and unease, of awe at the engineering and sympathy for the people who lived there. Standing in the church on the 5th level, imagining it filled with worshippers in the flickering light of oil lamps, their voices rising in hymns that echoed off the stone walls, this is an experience that transcends tourism and touches something deeper, something universal about the human relationship with darkness, shelter, and faith. The challenge for the Turkish authorities responsible for managing the site is balancing the demands of tourism with the need to preserve and protect the underground city. The flow of millions of visitors through the tunnels creates wear on the stone surfaces, introduces moisture and contaminants, and places stress on the ventilation systems that have been functioning, in some cases, for thousands of years. Certain areas have been closed to visitors to prevent further degradation, and access is carefully controlled to limit the number of people underground at any given time. The long-term preservation of Derinkuyu requires ongoing investment in monitoring, maintenance, and conservation, a commitment that the Turkish government has made, but that faces the constant tension between economic exploitation and cultural stewardship. Let us return now to the question that has haunted our entire exploration of Derinkuyu, the question of abandonment. Why was this city, this masterpiece of human engineering, this fortress that had protected its inhabitants for centuries, simply abandoned? Why did the people of Cappadocia walk away from the underground cities and never return? And why, having abandoned them, did they forget them so completely that the cities had to be rediscovered by accident nearly half a millennium later? We have touched on this question before, but let us now examine it more closely, because the answer, or rather, the multiple possible answers, tell us something profound about the relationship between human societies and their survival infrastructure. The most commonly cited explanation for the abandonment is the Pax Ottomanica, the long period of relative stability and internal peace brought by Ottoman rule. Under the Ottomans, the constant threat of external invasion that had defined Cappadocian life for millennia was effectively eliminated. The Ottoman military controlled the borders. The Ottoman administration maintained internal order. The cycles of raid, retreat, and recovery that had made the underground cities essential were finally broken. Without the threat that justified their existence, the underground cities lost their purpose. This explanation is compelling but incomplete. Other regions of the Ottoman Empire had defensive infrastructure, castles, fortifications, walled cities, that also became militarily obsolete under Ottoman rule. But those structures were not abandoned and forgotten. They were repurposed, converted to civilian use, incorporated into the fabric of daily life. Why were the underground cities treated differently? Part of the answer may lie in the nature of underground space itself. A castle can be converted into a warehouse, a government building, or a residence. A walled city can expand beyond its walls, incorporating the old fortifications into the new urban landscape. But an underground city is by its nature hidden, enclosed, and disconnected from the surface. You cannot easily repurpose an underground room. The darkness, the dampness, the limited access, these features, which were advantages during an emergency, become serious disadvantages for everyday use. Once the emergency ends, the underground spaces become inconvenient, uncomfortable, and unnecessary. Another part of the answer may be cultural. The Ottoman period brought significant cultural changes to Cappadocia. The Turkish settlers who gradually became the majority population in the region did not share the Cappadocian Christian tradition of underground habitation. For the Turkish Muslim community, the underground cities were relics of a different culture, a different faith, a different way of life. They were not invested in maintaining them, and they had no cultural memory of their construction or use. The remaining Christian communities, meanwhile, were diminished in number and influence, and their knowledge of the underground cities may have been fragmentary and declining. Religious change may also have played a role. For the Christian communities that had used the underground churches and chapels, the shift to surface worship that accompanied the stabilization of the region would have reduced the need for underground religious spaces. And for the Muslim communities that replaced them, the underground churches had no religious significance and no practical value. The sacred spaces that had been the spiritual heart of the underground cities became irrelevant, and with their spiritual function gone, the cities themselves lost much of their cultural meaning. There is also a more practical consideration: maintenance. An underground city requires ongoing maintenance to remain functional. Ventilation shafts need to be kept clear. Wells need to be maintained. Stone doors need to be periodically checked and adjusted. Corridors need to be cleared of debris. Water infiltration needs to be managed. Without regular maintenance, the underground infrastructure gradually deteriorates. Shafts become clogged, wells run dry, corridors fill with fallen rock. The city slowly becomes inaccessible, one passage at a time, one room at a time, until the entrances themselves are blocked and the entire complex is sealed off from the surface. This process of gradual deterioration would have reinforced the process of forgetting. As physical access to the underground city became more difficult, the practical knowledge of its layout and features became less useful. As the older generation that remembered the underground city died off, the younger generation, for whom the city was already partially inaccessible and culturally irrelevant, had little incentive to maintain the knowledge. Within a few generations, the underground city had passed from living memory into legend, and from legend into oblivion. The forgetting of Derinkuyu raises a broader question about the durability of human knowledge. We tend to assume that significant achievements, great buildings, great technologies, great works of art will be remembered, will be preserved in the collective memory of the civilization that created them. But history is full of examples of forgetting, of knowledge lost, of achievements buried and rediscovered only by accident centuries later. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, was destroyed, and most of its contents were lost forever. The Roman recipe for concrete, a material so durable that Roman structures still stand 2,000 years later, was forgotten for centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek astronomical calculator of extraordinary sophistication, was lost to the sea for 2 millennia before being recovered by sponge divers in 1900. The Maya civilization of Central America built magnificent cities in the jungle, and within a few centuries of their abandonment, the jungle had swallowed them so completely that their existence was doubted by scholars until the 19th century. Derinkuyu belongs to this tradition of lost knowledge, the tradition of great human achievements that were swallowed by time, buried by neglect, and erased from memory by the relentless turnover of generations. It is a sobering reminder that nothing we build is permanent, that no achievement is so great that it cannot be forgotten, that the default state of human knowledge is not preservation but loss. And it raises a question for the future. What are we building today that will be forgotten? What achievements of our own civilization will be buried and lost, rediscovered by some future accident, marveled at by people who cannot understand how such things could have been created and then abandoned? The thought is both humbling and motivating, humbling because it reminds us of our impermanence, motivating because it challenges us to record, to preserve, to remember, so that the achievements of the present are not lost to the future as thoroughly as Derinkuyu was lost to us. There is one more aspect of Derinkuyu that deserves our attention before we conclude our exploration, and that is the question of what the underground city tells us about the nature of community. Derinkuyu was not built by individuals. It was not built by a single leader or a single generation. It was built by a community, or rather, by a succession of communities working across centuries, each contributing to a shared project that transcended any individual lifetime. The first people who carved the first rooms into the Cappadocian Tuff did not live to see the 18th level. The people who carved the 18th level did not know the names of those who had started the work, but they were all part of the same project, the same endeavor, the same multi-generational commitment to survival. This kind of intergenerational cooperation is one of the most remarkable things about Derinkuyu. It required not just engineering skill but social cohesion, the ability to maintain a shared sense of purpose across centuries, to transmit knowledge and traditions from generation to generation, to invest labor in projects whose benefits would not be fully realized for decades or centuries. Each generation that carved a new level, that dug a new well, that extended a connecting tunnel, was investing in the survival of future generations that they would never meet. This is an extraordinary form of altruism, a commitment to the future that transcends individual self-interest and embraces the continuity of the community as a whole. The social organization required to build and maintain Derinkuyu also tells us something about the nature of ancient communities that is often overlooked. We tend to think of ancient peoples as simpler, less organized, less capable than ourselves. Derinkuyu contradicts this assumption forcefully. The people who built this city were not simple, they were not primitive, they were sophisticated engineers, skilled organizers, effective leaders, and resilient survivors. They solved problems that would challenge modern engineers. They created systems that functioned effectively for centuries. They maintained social cohesion under conditions of extreme stress. And they did it all without computers, without power tools, without formal engineering education, without any of the technological advantages that we take for granted. What they had was knowledge, practical, hands-on knowledge accumulated over generations and transmitted through apprenticeship, through oral tradition, through the simple act of working alongside someone who had done it before. This knowledge was not written in textbooks. It was not recorded in databases. It was embedded in the hands and minds of the people who used it, knowledge of the rock, of the tools, of the techniques, of the hazards, of the solutions. When the people who held this knowledge left the underground cities and never returned, the knowledge went with them. And when they died, the knowledge died. This is why Derinkuyu can feel at times so alien, so difficult to understand, so hard to reconstruct. We are looking at the physical results of a body of knowledge that no longer exists. We can see the rooms, the tunnels, the shafts, the doors. We can measure them, map them, photograph them, analyze them, but we cannot fully recreate the knowledge that produced them. The stone preserves the product but not the process. The city remains, but the understanding that built it is gone. And yet, standing in the tunnels of Derinkuyu, feeling the cool air on your skin, running your hands along the smooth stone walls, you can sense something of that lost knowledge. You can sense it in the proportions of the rooms, not too wide, not too narrow, not too high, not too low. You can sense it in the placement of the ventilation channels, positioned just so, angled just right, sized just enough. You can sense it in the curve of the stone doors, perfectly balanced, perfectly fitted, perfectly designed to roll into place and seal a corridor with the push of a few hands. There is an elegance to Derinkuyu that transcends mere functionality. It is not just well engineered, it is well crafted. The surfaces are smooth, the edges are clean, the transitions between levels are graceful. This was not hurried, sloppy work done in panic by desperate people. This was careful, deliberate, skilled work done by craftsmen who took pride in their labor and cared about the quality of their creation. This is perhaps the most human thing about Derinkuyu, not the fear that inspired it, not the engineering that enabled it, but the care that shaped it. Even in the depths of crisis, even in the face of existential threat, the people who built this city took the time to do it well. They smoothed the walls, they leveled the floors, they carved the lamp niches with precision, they shaped the stone doors with artistry. They created a space that was not just safe but dignified, a place where human beings could live underground without losing their humanity. This is what Derinkuyu tells us about ourselves. Not that we are fearful creatures who burrow into the ground when danger comes. Not that we are clever engineers who can solve any problem with enough ingenuity, but that we are beings who insist on beauty, on quality, on meaning, even in the most desperate circumstances. We carve churches in the dark. We build schools in the stone. We smooth the walls of our underground rooms not because it makes them safer, but because it makes them ours. We refuse to let the circumstances of our survival define the quality of our living. This is the deepest lesson of Derinkuyu, not how to build an underground city, but how to remain human when the world forces you underground. As we prepare to leave the underground city for the last time, let us take one final look around. Let us stand in the church on the 5th level and imagine the voices raised in prayer. Let us walk through the school and imagine the children, wide-eyed in the lamplight, learning their letters, their numbers, their stories. Let us pass through the kitchens and imagine the smell of bread baking in stone ovens, the warmth of cooking fires, the simple comfort of a shared meal in the darkness. Let us visit the stables and imagine the goats bleating, the cattle shuffling, the familiar sounds of farm life transplanted underground. Let us pause at one of the great stone doors and imagine the moment it was rolled shut, the grinding of stone on stone, the thud of finality, the knowledge that the world above was now separated from the world below by half a ton of volcanic rock. And let us climb. Let us ascend through the levels, one by one, past the living quarters and the storage rooms, past the wells and the ventilation shafts, past the narrow defensive corridors and the dead-end passages, up through the stables, up through the entrance hall, up into the light. The sunlight is blinding. The air is warm and dry, carrying the scent of dust and time and the faint, sweet smell of wildflowers. The sky is enormous, impossibly vast after the enclosed spaces below, a deep, luminous blue stretching from horizon to horizon. The fairy chimneys stand on the distant hills, their strange mushroom shapes casting long shadows in the afternoon light. A bird sings somewhere, a dog barks, the sounds of the surface world, so ordinary and so precious. You stand in the light and you breathe. You breathe the open air, filling your lungs with the scent of the living world. And you think about the people who emerged from this same spot, century after century, blinking in the same sunlight, breathing the same air, feeling the same overwhelming relief that the darkness was over and the light had returned. They are gone, their names are lost, their faces are unknown. Their voices have been silent for centuries, but the city they built endures. The rooms they carved still hold their shape. The doors they balanced still roll in their channels. The ventilation shafts they drilled still breathe. The wells they dug still reach the water. Derinkuyu endures. What happens next for the underground city? The future of Derinkuyu depends on the delicate balance between preservation, exploration, and accessibility. Turkish authorities, working with international archaeological organizations, continue to excavate and document new sections of the city. Advanced technologies, ground-penetrating radar, three-dimensional laser scanning, drone-mounted cameras capable of navigating narrow passages, are being deployed to map sections of the city that are too dangerous or too inaccessible for human exploration. Each new survey reveals new details, new rooms, new passages, new questions. The Nevşehir underground city, discovered in 2014, has opened an entirely new chapter in the study of Cappadocian underground architecture. If the preliminary estimates of its size are accurate, it may dwarf even Derinkuyu, and its excavation could take decades. The discovery has reinvigorated interest in the underground cities of the region and has prompted new surveys and exploration at sites that had previously been considered fully documented. There is also growing interest in the potential lessons that Derinkuyu and the other underground cities can offer for modern challenges. Urban planners in densely populated cities around the world are exploring underground construction as a way to address the pressures of urbanization, underground transportation systems, underground commercial spaces, underground residential areas. Climate scientists are studying the thermal properties of underground habitation as a model for energy-efficient building design. And engineers designing habitats for potential human settlement on other worlds, the Moon, Mars, are looking at the underground cities of Cappadocia as case studies in how large populations can live sustainably beneath the surface. The possibility of underground habitation on Mars is particularly relevant to the legacy of Derinkuyu. The Martian surface is bombarded by harmful radiation that the planet's thin atmosphere cannot block. Any long-term human settlement on Mars would almost certainly need to be underground, protected by layers of rock and soil from the radiation above. The engineering challenges of building such a settlement, maintaining air supply, managing water, controlling temperature, handling waste, supporting human psychological health in enclosed subterranean spaces, are remarkably similar to the challenges that the builders of Derinkuyu faced and solved thousands of years ago. The ancient Cappadocians did not have modern technology, but they had something equally valuable: practical experience, accumulated over generations, in the art and science of living underground. There is a poetry to the idea that the knowledge embedded in Derinkuyu, knowledge that was lost, forgotten, buried for centuries, might one day contribute to humanity's expansion beyond the earth. The same instinct that drove ancient Anatolian farmers underground to escape the cavalry charges of the Cimmerians might, in some distant future, help human beings survive beneath the red soil of another world. The stone doors of Derinkuyu, sealed against the invaders of 1,000 years ago, might find their echo in the airlocks of a Martian habitat, sealed against the hostile vacuum of space. This is the legacy of Derinkuyu, not just a city, not just an archaeological site, not just a tourist attraction, but a testament to the human capacity for adaptation, for ingenuity, for survival. A reminder that when the world becomes uninhabitable, when the armies come, when the sky turns hostile, when the surface is no longer safe, human beings do not simply accept their fate. They dig, they carve, they build, they create new worlds beneath the old. They carry their families, their animals, their grain, their faith, their stories, their schools, their music, their love into the darkness, and there, in the heart of the stone, they endure. Let us, in these final passages, reflect on what we have learned in our two-part journey through Derinkuyu. We have learned that the earth beneath our feet is not inert, not empty, not dead. It is a medium, as workable, as shapeable, as full of potential as any building material on the surface. The builders of Derinkuyu understood this. They looked at the volcanic tuff of Cappadocia and saw not just rock, but possibility. They saw rooms, corridors, churches, schools, wells, stables, granaries. They saw a city, and they carved it into being with their own hands. We have learned that human ingenuity is not a product of technology. The builders of Derinkuyu had no power tools, no electricity, no computers, no formal engineering education. What they had was understanding, an intimate, practical, experiential understanding of the rock, the air, the water, the forces of gravity and pressure and flow. They solved problems that would challenge modern engineers, and they did it with bronze chisels and oil lamps and the accumulated wisdom of generations. Technology is a tool, but ingenuity is a quality of the human mind, and it does not require technology to flourish. we have learned that fear is a builder. The underground cities of Cappadocia were born from fear, fear of invasion, fear of destruction, fear of death. But fear, when it is channeled rather than surrendered to, becomes a powerful creative force. The fear that drove the people of Cappadocia underground also drove them to create something extraordinary, a city that is, in its own way, as impressive as any pyramid, any cathedral, any palace on the surface. Fear built Derinkuyu, but what fear built, courage maintained and hope sustained. We have learned that community is the foundation of survival. No individual built Derinkuyu. No individual could have. The city was the work of communities that cooperated, organized, shared labor, shared resources, shared knowledge, and shared the burden of survival across generations. The social bonds that held these communities together, bonds of family, of faith, of mutual obligation, were as essential to the survival of the underground population as the ventilation shafts and the stone doors. Without those bonds, the infrastructure would have been useless. A city is not just rooms and corridors. A city is people, and without the people, the rooms are just holes in the rock. We have learned that forgetting is as human as remembering. Derinkuyu was forgotten. Completely, thoroughly, absolutely forgotten. A city that housed 20,000 people was erased from human memory within a few generations of its abandonment. This is sobering. It reminds us that nothing we build is permanent, that no achievement is so great that it cannot be lost, that the maintenance of knowledge requires active effort, recording, transmitting, teaching, remembering. If we do not make that effort, even the greatest works of human hands will eventually be swallowed by time. And we have learned that rediscovery is possible. What is lost can be found, what is forgotten can be remembered, what is buried can be unearthed. The chickens that disappeared behind a wall in 1963 led to the rediscovery of an underground world that had been hidden for centuries. The curiosity of a homeowner, the dedication of archaeologists, the support of a government, and the interest of a global public combined to bring Derinkuyu back into the light, or rather, to bring the light back into Derinkuyu. There is one last thing to say about Derinkuyu, and it is perhaps the most important thing of all. The underground city is not dead. It is not a ruin, not a relic, not a monument to a vanished past. It is alive. The ventilation shafts still draw air. The wells still hold water. The stone doors still roll in their channels. The rooms are still habitable, cool in summer, warm in winter, sheltered from wind and rain and the burning Anatolian sun. If necessity demanded it, if the world above became once again too dangerous to endure, the people of Cappadocia could descend into Derinkuyu tomorrow and live there, just as their ancestors did for weeks or months at a time. This is not a hypothetical observation. It is a statement of fact. The infrastructure works, the engineering is sound, the systems function. After more than 1,000 years of abandonment, after centuries of neglect and forgetting, after flooding and collapse and the slow erosion of time, Derinkuyu still works. The city endures because the rock endures, and the rock endures because it was chosen well and worked with skill by people who understood it intimately. In a world of impermanence, where buildings crumble and technologies become obsolete and entire civilizations rise and fall within a few centuries, the survival of Derinkuyu is remarkable. It is a reminder that when human beings build with understanding, when they work with their materials rather than against them, when they design for durability rather than convenience, when they invest the time and care and skill to do the job right, they can create things that last, not just for years. Not just for centuries, but for millennia. Derinkuyu has lasted for millennia, and there is every reason to believe that it will last for millennia more. Long after the modern buildings above it have crumbled to dust, long after the roads and bridges and towers of our era have been reduced to rubble and rust, the underground city will remain silent, cool, dark, and intact. The rooms will hold their shape, the ventilation shafts will breathe, the wells will reach the water. The stone doors will stand ready to be rolled shut against whatever danger the future may bring. This is the promise of Derinkuyu. Not just a shelter from the past, but a shelter for the future. Not just a monument to ancient ingenuity, but a model for future survival. Not just a city beneath the earth, but an idea, the idea that human beings can adapt to anything, can survive anything, can endure anything as long as they have the courage to go deep, the wisdom to build well, and the faith to believe that the light will return. The sun is setting over Cappadocia. The fairy chimneys cast long shadows across the plateau. The sky turns from blue to gold to crimson, painting the volcanic landscape in colors that have been changing here since long before humans first walked this ground. The town of Derinkuyu settles into its evening routine, the call to prayer from the mosque, the clatter of dishes in kitchens, the laughter of children playing in the streets, the quiet conversations of neighbors on doorsteps. Beneath their feet, the city sleeps. 18 levels of rooms and corridors, carved from the heart of an ancient volcano, waiting in the darkness. The air moves slowly through the ventilation shafts, a faint, constant breath that has continued without interruption for longer than anyone can remember. The water stands still in the deep wells, reflecting nothing, holding the coldness of the earth. The stone doors rest in their channels, massive and patient, ready to be called into service if the need should ever arise again. The city remembers what the people above have forgotten. It remembers the footsteps of 20,000 souls, the voices raised in prayer, the crying of children, the bleating of goats, the grinding of grain, the pressing of grapes, the flickering of oil lamps. It remembers the fear and the courage, the despair and the hope, the darkness and the yearning for light. It remembers everything. And it keeps its silence, holding its memories in the stone like fossils in the rock, preserved beyond the reach of time. Derinkuyu. The city beneath the earth, 18 stories of human defiance, a monument to the will to survive, a testament to the ingenuity of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, a mystery that has been partially revealed but never fully solved, a story that began in the darkness of prehistory and has not yet reached its end. The story continues, the excavation continues, the discovery continues. And somewhere beneath the golden plains of Cappadocia, in a room that has not been seen by human eyes for centuries, there is a wall. Behind that wall there is a passage. Behind that passage there is another room. And in that room there is a secret that the earth has been keeping for a very, very long time. One day someone will find it. Until then the city waits, as it has always waited, in the dark, in the stone, in the heart of the earth. Derinkuyu endures.